of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The thirst beneath the stone. Before pipes, before pumps, before the hiss of pressurized water rushing through city walls and the gleam of chrome fixtures in tiled rooms, there was silence underground. A different kind of intelligence ruled the dark in those early millennia of human civilization, patient, slow, and carved in stone. It was not the intelligence of machines or algorithms, but something older and in many ways more impressive, the accumulated observational genius of generations of people who had no margin for error. You got water right, or you died. That was the entire equation, and it shaped everything. Thousands of years ago, people across the ancient world discovered something that must have felt, to those first observers, like a gift from whatever gods they worshipped. Deep inside the earth, water gathered. It did not wait for rain. It did not evaporate under the punishing sun. It pooled in cracks formed by geological upheaval millions of years before the first human drew breath. It seeped through limestone walls dissolved over eons by the slow chemistry of carbonic acid, and it collected in chambers that no summer drought could touch, and no invading army could easily poison or destroy. Water underground was, in a very real sense, the most valuable secret the earth kept. And ancient people spent millennia to access it, store it, and protect it. Rather than fearing those dark vaults beneath their feet, ancient engineers descended into them. They brought torches twisted from dried grasses and animal fat. They brought copper chisels and stone hammers. They brought ropes woven from plant fiber and leather harnesses stitched by hand. And they brought something even more essential than any of those tools: a plan. Not a plan scrawled in blueprints, those came much later, but a plan held in the mind, transmitted through demonstration, preserved in the memory of specialists whose entire social identity was built around the mastery of underground water. This story begins, as most great human stories do, with thirst. In the regions where the most sophisticated ancient water systems developed, the high dry plateaus of Persia, the limestone hills of the Levant, the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the wind-scoured deserts of Arabia, the canyon lands of the American Southwest, thirst was not a metaphor. It was a daily physical reality that organized every aspect of social life. Where you could live was determined by where you could find water. Where you built your city was determined by the same equation. How large your population could grow, how much food you could produce, how many soldiers you could field, how much trade you could conduct. All of it ultimately traced back to one fundamental question: how much water can we reliably access, in all seasons, in all years, good and bad? The surface answers to that question were exhausted early. Rivers were the first solution, and civilizations grew up along them with what seems, in retrospect, like inevitability: the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River. But rivers are demanding partners. They flood, they shift course, they carry disease, they dry 2 trickles in drought years. They are the territory of whoever lives upstream, which means they are a source of perpetual political vulnerability. A city that depends entirely on a surface river is a city that can be strangled by whoever controls the headwaters. Underground water had none of those vulnerabilities. It was stable across seasons in ways that rivers could never be, because it was insulated from both the extremes of wet years and the punishing scarcity of dry ones. The great aquifers and water-bearing rock formations that ancient engineers tapped into had been accumulating water for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. Drawing from them was like drawing from a reservoir so vast that within a human lifetime, or even many human lifetimes, it barely seemed to diminish. The ancients did not think in terms of aquifer depletion. They thought in terms of permanence, and for the time scales they were operating on, they were not wrong. What made the development of deep rock water chambers so remarkable is that it happened in broadly similar forms, independently across multiple civilizations with no contact with one another. The Qanot systems of Persia, the rock-cut cisterns of the Nabateans, the underground tanks of Sri Lanka, the subterranean water chambers of the Aztec and Maya, the carved cisterns of the ancient Levant. These were not variations on a single shared blueprint. They were independent solutions arrived at by different cultures operating on different geology, in different climates, at different technological levels. What they shared was not technology but necessity. And necessity, as the oldest cliché in the human playbook correctly states, is the mother of invention. The people who built these systems were not exceptional in the way we tend to think of exceptional historical figures. They were not philosopher kings or military geniuses or visionary artists. They were, for the most part, specialists of a deeply practical kind: surveyors, diggers, plasterers, engineers in the original sense of that word, meaning people who solved problems with the resources at hand. In Persia, the Muqans formed a hereditary professional class that passed their knowledge in near-sacred secrecy from one generation to the next, treating the understanding of underground water as intellectual property worth protecting. In other cultures, this knowledge was held by priestly castes, or royal engineers, or simply by old men and women who had spent decades observing the land and had accumulated wisdom that no young person could manufacture from scratch. What they all understood, in their different ways and languages and cosmologies, was a truth that modern hydrology has since confirmed with instrumentation and satellite imaging. Water underground is not random, it follows rules. It obeys geology the way a river obeys gravity, finding the path of least resistance through permeable rock, pooling where impermeable layers block its descent, flowing downhill through fractures and dissolved channels at speeds that range from imperceptibly slow to surprisingly swift, depending on the nature of the rock. To access it reliably, you had to understand not just where it was at any given moment, but where it was going, where it came from, and how the shape of the rock around it would influence its behavior over time. That understanding was built over generations through a process that has no clean modern analog. It was not science in the institutional sense. There were no journals, no peer review, no controlled experiments. It was something closer to what we might call empirical wisdom, the slow accumulation of observation and outcome, failure and success, lucky strike and dry hole, passed forward through story and demonstration and apprenticeship. A young Muqan in ancient Persia did not learn his trade from a textbook. He learned it by descending into shafts with his father or his master, watching how the old man read the rock, listening to explanations offered in the lamplight 100 feet underground, and slowly, over years, developing the eye, the capacity to look at a cliff face or a dry riverbed and see, through the surface, what lay beneath. There is something profound about that kind of knowledge. It has a texture and a density that purely theoretical understanding lacks. It is knowledge that has been tested against reality, repeatedly, under conditions where failure had genuine consequences. The ancient water engineers who built the great underground systems of the pre-modern world were not operating in the safety of theoretical abstraction. Every decision they made was real, and the cost of a wrong decision could be measured in thirst, in crop failure, in the slow decline of a community that had staked its future on a shaft that came up dry. And yet they succeeded, again and again, across wildly different landscapes and geological contexts, with nothing more than hand tools, inherited knowledge, and the kind of patience that modern industrial civilization has largely lost the capacity for. Some of the underground water systems they built required decades of continuous labor before a single drop of water reached the surface communities they were designed to serve. The workers who broke ground on a major canot often knew they would not live to see it completed. They were building for their grandchildren, investing in a future they would never personally inhabit, sustained by the conviction, learned from the previous generation's investment in the systems they themselves now benefited from, that the work was worth doing even when its rewards were remote. That is, at its core, what the story of ancient underground water management is about. It is not simply a story about clever engineering or impressive archaeology, though it is certainly both of those things. It is a story about what human communities are capable of when they take a long view, when they organize their collective intelligence and labor around a problem that matters, when they treat the hard work of ensuring survival not as a burden to be minimized but as the central project of civilized life. The deep rock chambers they carved are monuments to that capacity, more honest and in some ways more impressive than the temples and palaces that tend to dominate our image of the ancient world, because they were built not to celebrate power but to sustain life. The silence down in those chambers, in the spaces where ancient workers spent years of their lives cutting stone and shaping channels and smoothing walls, that silence holds something worth recovering. It holds the echo of a civilizational intelligence that understood, in a way that our own noisy, spurning, extraction-oriented world is still struggling to grasp, that the relationship between human communities and the water systems that sustain them is not a relationship of domination but of careful, patient, multi-generational cooperation. The rock gives up its water on its own terms, in its own time. The best you can do is understand those terms well enough to work with them. The ancient engineers did, and in doing so, they built some of the most durable and consequential infrastructure in human history. Infrastructure that is not celebrated on coins or in epic poetry, that does not glitter in museum cases or appear in popular accounts of ancient civilization, but that made everything else possible. No irrigation without water, no city without water, no army, no trade, no art, no philosophy without the quiet, unglamorous, underground work of finding where the water was and building the dark chambers that brought it home. This is where their story begins, not in glory, but in thirst, not at the surface, but beneath it, in the dark, with torches and chisels, and the patient willingness to go where the water was, however deep that turned out to be. Segment 2. Reading the rock. The first challenge wasn't digging, it was listening. And listening, in this context, meant something far more complex and multidimensional than simply pressing an ear to the ground and hoping for the best. It meant developing, over years of apprenticeship and decades of personal practice, a form of sensory and intellectual attunement to landscape that modern people have almost entirely lost the capacity to read the Earth's surface as a text written by underground forces, a record of what lay beneath, encoded in topography, vegetation, geology, and the behavior of living things. Ancient surveyors in Egypt, Persia, India, the Mediterranean, and across the broader ancient world learned to read the landscape the way a skilled sailor reads the sea, not as a collection of isolated observations but as an integrated system of signs, each one meaningful only in relation to the others, all of them pointing toward a hidden truth that no single clue could reveal on its own. A slight depression in the earth that seemed at first glance to be merely a topographical accident might, to an experienced eye, indicate a location where the bedrock dipped and surface water had once collected, suggesting the presence of a permeable layer below. A patch of unexpectedly lush and green vegetation in an otherwise dry hillside was one of the most reliable indicators of all. Plants do not lie about water, and certain species in particular, like tamarisk, wisha, will find and mark underground moisture with their root systems, with their root systement. With suspicious Sipisalist, and Mysepisec Pipike Sipupips Bassicated Basapir, Upap Kipraplates apt Butter to Pid up a dup of with athlux Mapitums prepared, but the at a pat catatat apas def where back hat castas a pack cap of catwork of else book deck escapius that fab pet The behavior of animals was another layer of the text. Certain insects, particularly mosquitoes and gnats in arid regions, tend to cluster near locations where subsurface moisture comes close enough to the surface to create microhabitats of slightly higher humidity. Bees, which need water to regulate hive temperature and to produce honey, tend to establish their colonies within practical distance of reliable water sources, which in dry landscapes often means underground sources that manifest as seeps or springs. Ancient surveyors learned to watch the flight paths of bees toward evening, when the insects were returning from foraging, and to follow those paths back toward their origin. In some traditions, this practice was so established that specialized bee watchers were employed specifically to track the insects' movements and report back to the engineering teams responsible for locating new water sources. The morning behavior of the land itself was a further source of information. In regions where the diurnal temperature swing is large, as it is in most desert and semi-arid environments, ground that is warmer than the surrounding surface in the morning hours, when the sun has not yet had time to heat everything, may indicate a location where geothermal energy, or the insulating effect of moisture, is preventing the overnight cooling that affects the surrounding rock and soil. Ancient surveyors who spent years working the same landscapes developed an almost tactile sensitivity to these temperature variations, running their hands along rock faces in the early morning hours and noting the places where the stone retained an unexpected warmth. These locations were marked and returned to, cross-referenced with other observations, and gradually built into a picture of what the geology below might look like. In Persia, the specialists who performed this work, the muqans, developed their capacity for landscape reading over generations, and the knowledge they accumulated was treated as a form of intellectual capital worthy of protection. Muqans were among the most highly respected and compensated specialists in ancient Persian society, sought after by kings and local governors alike, and their methods were closely guarded. Apprentice muqans typically spent many years in observation and assistance before being trusted with independent survey work, and the transmission of knowledge from master to apprentice was as much about developing the right habits of perception as it was about conveying specific technical information. You could tell a young surveyor what to look for, but you could not simply tell them how to see it. That required time in the field, in all seasons, under all conditions, until the landscape began to speak to them the way it spoke to their teachers. The geological understanding that underlay all of this observation was sophisticated, even if it was expressed in terms that bore no resemblance to modern scientific vocabulary. Ancient surveyors across multiple cultures understood, in operational if not theoretical terms, the basic principles of what we now call hydrogeology, the study of water in rock and soil. They understood that water moves underground from high elevations to low ones, following the path of least resistance through permeable layers of rock and soil while being blocked by impermeable ones. They understood that certain rock types, limestone, sandstone, certain volcanic formations, tend to hold and transmit water, while others, granite, shale, dense clay, tend to block it. They understood that the boundaries between these different rock types were often where the most accessible water could be found, because water accumulating in a permeable layer above an impermeable one would tend to pool at that boundary and flow laterally along it, sometimes emerging as a spring at the surface where the impermeable layer intersected the hillside. This understanding was developed not through formal geological study, but through the accumulation of direct experience, the correlation, over many generations, between specific surface features and what was found when shafts were sunk into the earth below them. A muqan master in 500 BCE could not have explained the concept of an aquifer in modern scientific terms, but he could look at a mountain valley and tell you with reasonable confidence where the permeable gravel beds that carried water down from the snowfields above were likely to be accessible, where the impermeable clay layers would trap that water and allow a productive well to be sunk, and how deep you would need to go before you struck reliable moisture rather than the dry capillary zone above the true water table. That knowledge was as sophisticated, in practical terms, as anything in a modern hydrology textbook. It was just organized differently, encoded in experience rather than theory, transmitted through relationship rather than institution. The reading of rock also extended to the rock itself once workers were underground. The color of stone told experienced miners and shaft sinkers a great deal about its moisture content and its proximity to underground water. Dark staining on rock faces, particularly the blackish or greenish discoloration caused by the growth of moisture-dependent algae and bacteria, was one of the most reliable indicators that water was nearby. The smell of the air in a shaft changed as it approached the water table, a shift from the dry, dusty smell of arid rock to something cooler and more organic, a faint biological richness that experienced workers learned to detect and interpret. The behavior of the tools changed too. Rock near water tends to be slightly softer and more friable than the same rock type in dry conditions, because the chemical processes that water enables, the slow dissolution of minerals, the penetration of carbonic acid, weaken the crystal structure of the stone over geological time. Skilled shaft sinkers could feel this change in the resistance of the rock to their chisels and hammers, and it told them something about how close they were to what they were looking for. Temperature was another underground guide. The deeper you go into the earth, the more stable the temperature becomes, converging toward the mean annual surface temperature of the region. But in locations where underground water flow is active, where water is moving through rock fractures or permeable layers, the temperature of the rock and air around that water is influenced by the temperature of the water itself, which in turn reflects where it came from. Water flowing down from mountain snowfields tends to be cold, and the rock around active underground channels carrying such water will be measurably cooler than surrounding rock of the same type. Ancient shaft workers learned to notice these temperature gradients and to follow them, moving toward cooler areas of the rock face in the expectation that they indicated the proximity of flowing water. All of this, the surface survey, the observation of plants and animals and geology, the underground reading of color and smell and temperature and texture, came together in the mind of an experienced ancient water surveyor to form something that was, in functional terms, a mental model of the subsurface hydrology of a given landscape. It was not expressed in equations or diagrams. It was expressed as knowledge embodied, intuitive, holistic knowledge of the kind that modern cognitive scientists increasingly recognize as a distinct and sophisticated form of expertise, one that is in many ways more powerful than purely analytical knowledge because it integrates far more variables simultaneously than conscious analytical thought can manage. The ancient surveyors who possessed this knowledge were, in the truest sense, reading the rock. And what they read in it was the possibility of life, the hidden water that could sustain communities and landscapes that would otherwise be uninhabitable, the underground rivers and pooled reserves that a patient and skilled intelligence could access and bring to the surface. The reading came first, before any tool was lifted or any shaft was begun. It was the foundational act, the one on which everything else depended. And it was, in its own way, as impressive as anything that came after. Segment 3. Cutting the first shaft. Once a water source had been identified through the patient process of surface survey and geological reading, the real work began. And real work, in the context of ancient underground water extraction, meant something that the modern world, with its pneumatic drills, its powered ventilation systems, its laser-guided boring machines, and GPS-enabled survey instruments, can barely begin to appreciate. It meant descending into the earth with hand tools, by torchlight, in heat and dust and oxygen-thin air, cutting through some of the hardest materials on the planet, one hammer blow at a time, guided by nothing more than skill, experience, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. The first vertical shaft sunk at a new site was the most consequential act in the entire process. It was the commitment, the decision to invest weeks, months, or years of intensive labor in a location based on the surveyor's reading of the surface evidence. If the reading was right, the shaft would eventually reach water and become the starting point for a productive underground water system. If the reading was wrong, all that labor was wasted, and the team would have to begin again somewhere else, hopefully wiser for the failure, but certainly poorer in time and resources. The stakes of that first shaft were, therefore, enormous, and the decision to sink it was never made lightly. The dimensions of the initial shaft were dictated by a brutal practical calculus. It needed to be wide enough for a worker to descend, to swing tools, to fill a bucket, and to be pulled back out. But every additional inch of width meant additional cubic feet of rock to be removed, additional time and labor, additional cost. In most ancient traditions of shaft sinking across the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world, the standard working shaft was approximately the width of a man's shoulders, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. In the typical case, though shafts intended as permanent access points were sometimes considerably wider. The narrowness was not just an economic decision, it also had a structural logic. Narrower shafts were less prone to collapse, because the rock on either side was better supported and less likely to sprawl and fall under the stresses created by the removal of material below. Workers descended on rope platforms, essentially simple wooden boards or woven mats suspended from braided fiber ropes tied to a windlass at the surface. The windlass, a horizontal rotating drum mounted on a frame above the shaft opening, was operated by surface workers, who would lower and raise the underground crew as needed, lowering empty buckets and raising full ones, responding to the signals sent up the rope by the men below. Rope communication was a sophisticated system in its own right, a language of tugs and patterns that conveyed specific messages between the underground and surface teams without requiring shouted communication that the rock would have muffled and distorted beyond comprehension. Different combinations of tugs meant different things. This system is documented across multiple ancient cultures, from Persia to Egypt to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, suggesting that it was arrived at independently as the practical solution to a universal problem. The tools that ancient shaft sinkers used evolved over the millennia in ways that track the broader history of materials technology. The earliest rock cutting in water systems was done with stone tools, hard quartzite, or flint chisels and hammers that could make headway against softer rock types like limestone and sandstone, though at a brutally slow pace. The introduction of copper tools around 5,000 years ago represented a significant advancement in efficiency, particularly for softer rock, though copper is not hard enough to make much impression on granite or dense basalt. The real transformation came with bronze, and later iron metals hard enough to cut efficiently through a much wider range of geological materials, and tough enough to be resharpened and reused repeatedly, rather than being discarded after a few uses, as stone tools often were. The technique of rock cutting in ancient shaft sinking was not random hacking, but a methodical process informed by an understanding of how rock fractures. Stone is not monolithic, it has internal planes of weakness called joints and bedding planes, directions along which it is more likely to split cleanly when struck. Experienced shaft sinkers learned to read these planes and to position their tools to exploit them, cutting along the natural fracture directions of the rock rather than across them. A cut made with the grain of the rock required far less force and produced a cleaner result than one made against it. And over the course of sinking a shaft that might be 30 or 300 feet deep, the cumulative difference in labor between an experienced cutter working with the grain and an inexperienced one fighting against it could amount to weeks of additional work. The rubble produced by cutting the chips and chunks of rock removed from the shaft had to be hauled to the surface continuously, because a shaft filling up with its own debris was quickly an unusable shaft. The removal system was simple, but labor-intensive. Leather buckets or woven baskets were filled by the underground crew and sent up the rope to be emptied by the surface crew, a cycle that ran continuously as long as cutting was in progress. The volume of material removed from a deep shaft was substantial. A shaft 20 feet deep and 30 inches in diameter contains roughly 5 cubic yards of rock, which at the density of limestone weighs approximately 15,000 pounds. Moving that material to the surface in leather buckets, one load at a time, using human muscle and a rope windlass, was itself a significant physical undertaking, quite apart from the work of cutting the rock in the first place. The underground environment of an active shaft presented hazards that were managed through experience and precaution rather than the formal safety systems that modern excavation requires. The most immediate and continuous danger was the depletion of oxygen. In a narrow, deep shaft with no mechanical ventilation, the flame of a worker's oil lamp or torch was both a tool and a safety indicator. It lit the work, and it consumed the oxygen that made the work possible. Ancient shaft workers learned to read the flame with the same attention they gave to the rock. A bright, steady flame meant adequate oxygen. A flame that burned lower and yellower than normal meant the air was getting thin. A flame that flickered and began to gutter meant it was time to surface immediately, before the loss of consciousness that oxygen deprivation would bring. Some traditions describe the use of birds as living air quality monitors. A bird that sat quietly on a perch at the bottom of a shaft was a sign that the air was still adequate. A bird that became agitated or fell over was the signal to evacuate. Ventilation was sometimes improved by the construction of secondary shafts, narrower than the working shaft, positioned at intervals along the planned route of an underground channel system, which created the circulation of air that made extended underground work possible. In the great Qanat systems of Persia, these ventilation shafts were sunk at regular intervals along the planned route of the horizontal tunnel, both to improve air circulation for the workers and to allow debris to be removed from the tunnel as it was excavated. From the surface, these ventilation shaft openings, ringed by the spoil mounds of excavated material deposited around them, looked like rows of dark eyes watching the sky, and they are one of the most distinctive features of the ancient Qanat landscape, as seen from aerial photographs. Flooding was the other great underground danger, and it was particularly acute in shaft sinking, because the entire purpose of the exercise was to reach the water table, which meant that at some point in every successful shaft, the workers would encounter water, and the transition from dry rock to water-bearing rock was not always gradual or predictable. In some geological contexts, the water table was approached slowly, through increasingly moist rock that gave workers plenty of warning. In others, particularly in regions of fractured limestone or volcanic rock, where underground water moved through discrete channels rather than diffusing through permeable matrix, the transition could be sudden and violent. A worker's chisel would break through the last layer of dry rock, and water would pour in faster than the shaft could drain. Ancient shaft workers developed techniques for managing this risk. One common approach was to slow the pace of work as moisture indicators increased, maintaining a careful watch on the rate of water ingress and being prepared to retreat quickly if the inflow exceeded the capacity of the bailing system to keep up. Another was to approach the water table at an angle, sinking the shaft to a point just above the expected water level and then driving a diagonal or horizontal gallery toward the water-bearing zone rather than cutting directly through it from above. which gave workers more control over the rate of water entry and more options for retreat if the inflow became unmanageable. The moment when a shaft-sinking crew first encountered the water they had been seeking was, by all accounts in ancient texts and oral traditions, an experience charged with extraordinary emotional and sometimes spiritual significance. In Persian Qanot tradition, striking water in a newly sunk shaft was celebrated with prayers and offerings, with the recognition that months or years of dangerous, exhausting labor had been justified by the earth's confirmation that the survey had been correct. In some traditions, the first water drawn from a new shaft was treated as ritually significant, used in ceremonies or offered to deities before any ordinary domestic use was made of it. This was not mere superstition. It was the recognition that something genuinely momentous had occurred, that a connection had been established between the human community and the hidden water system of the earth, a connection that would sustain life for generations to come. At the bottom of a successful shaft, in the dark and the damp and the flickering lamplight, with water beginning to seep through the freshly cut rock face and the distant shouts of the surface crew coming down the shaft as a faint echo, the ancient shaft sinker's work was not finished. In many ways, it was only beginning. The vertical shaft was the entry point, the proof of concept. Now the real engineering would start, cutting horizontally into the water-bearing rock, shaping channels and chambers that could collect, store, and transport the water that the survey had promised and the shaft had confirmed. The deep rock chambers were about to become a reality, but first had to come the reading, and the cutting, and the long, dark, patient descent into the earth. That came first. Everything came from that. Segment 4. The Qanot, a river underground. Of all the solutions that ancient people devised for accessing and managing water in deep rock environments, none was more elegant, more durable, or more consequential than the Qanot. To call it merely a water management system is to undersell it, that way you might undersell a cathedral by calling it a large room. The Qanot is a work of applied genius that represents one of the highest expressions of ancient engineering intelligence. A solution to a complex hydrological problem that is, in its fundamental design, so well conceived that it requires no power source, produces no waste, and needs only periodic maintenance to function indefinitely. Some Qanots built 3,000 years ago are still flowing today. They will likely still be flowing 3,000 years from now, if the people who live above them continue to maintain them. Once the source was located, the next step was to determine the route of the tunnel, the path it would take from the intake zone at the base of the mountains to the outlet at the community below. This required a level of surveying sophistication that is remarkable for the ancient world. The tunnel had to maintain a specific gradient throughout its length, which, in a system that might extend for many miles through varying terrain, required the ability to measure elevation differences accurately across large horizontal distances. The Mucans accomplished this with a combination of instruments and techniques that included weighted strings for vertical measurement, calibrated rods for horizontal distance, and a surveying instrument called the mizan, essentially a sophisticated plumb level that allowed elevation differences to be calculated with considerable accuracy over long distances. The construction itself proceeded from the intake end backward toward the outlet, which is to say downhill. A counterintuitive approach that makes sense once you understand the engineering rationale. By starting at the water source and working downward, the builders always had a finished, functional section of tunnel behind them that could drain water away from the active construction phase, preventing the flooding that would have made construction impossible if they had tried to work from the outlet end upward toward the water table. The workers in the construction phase were, therefore, always working in conditions where water was present but controlled, seeping from the walls and ceiling of the tunnel, flowing away behind them through the already completed section, and giving them immediate feedback about whether they were maintaining the correct gradient. The vertical shafts that were sunk at intervals along the route of a Qanot served multiple purposes simultaneously, which is the kind of elegant multifunctionality that characterizes the best ancient engineering. They provided access for construction workers, allowing fresh teams to enter the tunnel at intermediate points, rather than requiring everyone to travel the full length from the intake end. They provided ventilation that made extended underground work possible, allowing fresh air to circulate through the tunnel system. They allowed debris from the tunnel excavation to be removed at multiple points simultaneously, dramatically speeding up the construction process. And once the Qanot was complete, they continued to serve as maintenance access points, allowing workers to enter the tunnel to clear sediment, repair wall damage, and monitor the condition of the system. The spacing of these shafts was not standardized across all Connaught systems, but was calibrated to the specific conditions of each project. In loose, unstable soils where the risk of shaft collapse was higher, the shafts were positioned closer together, which also reduced the distance that tunnel construction teams had to travel underground. In hard rock, where the geology was stable, the shafts could be spaced further apart, which reduced the overall construction effort. The decision about shaft spacing was one of the many judgment calls that experienced Mucan masters made based on their reading of the specific conditions at each site. The kind of contextual, experience-based decision-making that cannot be reduced to a formula and that distinguishes a master craftsperson from a skilled but inexperienced practitioner. The tunnels themselves varied considerably in their construction depending on the geological material through which they passed. In hard rock, the tunnel walls needed no reinforcement. The rock was self-supporting, and once the material was removed, the opening stayed open indefinitely. In softer materials like alluvial gravel, clay, and loose soil, the tunnel walls had to be reinforced, most commonly with rings of fired clay ceramic that fit together to line the interior of the tunnel, preventing collapse while allowing water to seep in through their joints from the surrounding saturated material. These ceramic rings were manufactured specifically for Connaught construction and have been found at archaeological sites across the ancient Persian world in enormous quantities, a testament to the industrial scale of Connaught building activity during the peak periods of Persian imperial expansion. The gradient of the tunnel floor was perhaps the most critical and technically demanding element of the entire system. Too shallow, and the water would not move fast enough. Sediment would accumulate, and the tunnel would gradually fill up and lose capacity. Too steep, and the water would move with enough velocity to erode the tunnel floor, progressively deepening it and potentially causing structural instability. The ideal gradient depended on the specific soil and rock conditions of each tunnel and the expected volume of water flow, and calculating it correctly required a sophisticated intuitive understanding of hydraulics that the master Mucans developed through years of direct observation of water behavior in completed systems. The Iranian Plateau, where the Connaught tradition reached its greatest development, is in many respects an ideal landscape for Connaught construction. It is bordered by high mountain ranges, the Alborz in the north, the Zagros in the west, that receives substantial precipitation as rain and snow. This water percolates into the alluvial fans at the base of the mountains and accumulates there in vast underground reserves. The cities and agricultural areas of the plateau interior are dry, with insufficient rainfall to support the population densities that Persian civilization required. The Connaught solved this mismatch with breathtaking elegance, connecting the mountain water reserves to the dry plains below through tunnels that might extend for 20, 30, or even 40 miles in the most ambitious cases, crossing beneath desert terrain that was effectively dead at the surface but alive with flowing water 20 or 30 feet underground. At its peak, the Connaught system of the Iranian plateau supported a population of several million people in one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth. It enabled the flourishing of sophisticated urban cultures, extensive agriculture, long-distance trade, and the kind of complex, stratified society that gives rise to art and philosophy and administration and all the other things that we associate with civilization. Without the Connaught, the great cities of ancient Persia, Persepolis, Pasargadae, Isfahan, Yazd, and dozens of others could not have existed. The Connaught was not just infrastructure in the mundane sense of the word. It was the physical foundation on which an entire civilization was built underground by the patience working to shafts and calculating light, hundred surface of a land, no obvious sign of what lay beneath it. The Connaught is the great hidden achievement of ancient Persian civilization, less famous than the palaces and relief sculptures of Persepolis, less visible than the great roads of the empire, but more fundamental to the actual survival and prosperity of the people who built those visible monuments. It is the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure, the water beneath the city beneath the empire, and it deserves to be understood as one of the greatest engineering achievements in the history of the human species. Segment 5, the rock cistern, catching what falls. Not every civilization had the luxury of nearby mountains and the extended alluvial fans that made Connaught construction possible. Not every landscape offered the combination of high elevation, water source, and accessible lower terrain that the Connaught design required. In places where the geology was wrong, where the mountains were too far away or too geologically complex, where the water table was too deep or too irregular to be tapped by a gently sloping tunnel, people devised a different solution, one that worked not by accessing the water that moved underground but by capturing the water that fell from the sky and storing it in the rock itself. The rock cistern is, in concept, perhaps even simpler than the canot. It is a chamber, carved or excavated into bedrock, sealed to prevent leakage, and filled by the collection of rainwater from catchment surfaces above. In practice, however, the design and construction of effective rock cisterns was a sophisticated engineering challenge that involved questions of hydrology, geology, materials, science, and structural engineering that ancient builders solved with considerable ingenuity. The fundamental problem that any cistern builder faces is the one of supply versus demand, ensuring that the cistern is large enough to store sufficient water to carry the community through the dry season between rainfalls, while also ensuring that the catchment system is extensive enough to fill the cistern to the required level during the rainy season. Getting this balance right required an accurate understanding of both the rainfall regime of the region, how much rain falls, in what months, at what intensity, and the water consumption needs of the community, how many people, how much water per person per day, for how many months without rain. Ancient cistern designers had no formal hydrological data to work from. They accumulated this understanding through generations of direct observation, and they calibrated their cistern designs to the specific conditions of each site based on that accumulated experience. The choice of rock type for cistern excavation was critically important. Ideal cistern rock was hard enough to be self-supporting, to hold its shape without requiring internal structural reinforcement, but not so hard that cutting it was prohibitively labor-intensive. Limestone was the preferred material across most of the Mediterranean world, the Levant, and North Africa, for several reasons. It is widely distributed in precisely the regions where cisterns were most needed. It is hard enough to form stable vaults and walls, and it has a natural chemistry that, under the right conditions, can partially self-seal as dissolved calcium carbonate precipitates onto interior surfaces. The ancient Nabateans, who were among the greatest cistern builders in history, worked primarily in the sandstone of the Petra region and the limestone of the Negev desert highlands, materials that gave their engineers excellent structural properties combined with kaolins, catchals, bakirials, but kirijal, ganjut spout bow with benjik school its ponik sans kawik wixel quill and a quick with bill and sad and with about that with us at with how fuck that's up us up got with fabaka podcast capacitors our cast whiskas oh stick mit ast bist bestow a scoff with force puppies The shapes of ancient rock cisterns were not arbitrary, but reflected sophisticated structural thinking. Round or oval plan forms were favored in many traditions because they distributed the pressure of the surrounding rock most evenly, minimizing the risk of cracking and collapse. Bell shapes wider at the bottom than at the top were common in the Levant and had the additional advantage of making it difficult for animals or people to accidentally fall in, since the narrow neck at the top required deliberate effort to enter. Barrel-vaulted rectangular cisterns were preferred in Roman traditions, where the geometry of supporting columns and arches made rectangular spaces more architecturally efficient. In every case, the form was chosen not purely for aesthetic reasons, but because of what it could do structurally, how it managed the forces acting on it from the surrounding rock and the water pressure from within. The excavation of a large rock cistern was an undertaking of months or years. Working from the access shaft or from multiple access points, teams of cutters would systematically remove rock from the interior of the planned chamber, working outward from the center toward the intended walls, periodically stopping to assess the stability of the remaining rock and to check the dimensions of the emerging space against the planned design. The rock removed from a cistern, unlike the spoil from a canot shaft, which had to be hauled up a narrow vertical shaft, could often be removed through the same horizontal access point that workers used to enter the chamber, which made the logistics of debris removal somewhat less challenging, though still substantial. A cistern intended to hold 100,000 gallons of water would require the removal of something in the range of 800 to 1,000 cubic yards of rock, depending on the geometry, which at the density of limestone of 1.5 million pounds of material to be something in the neighbourhood of million, within 1.5 million pound an accent of million and a pound out. Clockle brew, pool pound, how who walk how, or walk apple corn, or pour out how kissable how we fix with us away, put a quiver for Miss Widow, who tap soft, hard us our wood pack, have cargoes, the scarpa, gav of holes of gasco, had its cask, with a little bit more west, book of the communities around Petra, the great Nabatean city carved into the rose-red sandstone of southern Jordan, built cistern and water management systems of extraordinary ambition and sophistication. The Nabateans occupied a landscape that was, by any ordinary standard, inhospitable to urban settlement, a desert environment with irregular and unpredictable rainfall, no permanent rivers, and terrain so rugged that conventional irrigation was largely impossible. And yet, at its height, Petra supported a population estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people, making it one of the most significant cities in the ancient Middle East. The mechanism that made this possible was water management of exceptional ingenuity, centered on a system of rock-cut cisterns, surface channels, ceramic pipes, and settling tanks that captured every drop of the limited rainfall that fell on the surrounding mountains and stored it against the long dry months that characterized the Nabatean climate. The Nabatean approach to cistern design reflected a deep understanding of the specific hydrological conditions of their environment. The rainfall in the Petra region, though limited in annual total, tends to arrive in intense short-duration events, cloudburst storms that dump large volumes of water in a very short time. This is the worst possible form of rainfall for surface collection, because it produces flash floods, rather than the gentle sustained runoff that is easiest to direct into storage systems. The Nabateans designed their collection systems specifically to handle this challenge, building wide catchment surfaces on hillsides above their cisterns, connecting them through systems of carved channels and ceramic pipes that could rapidly transfer large volumes of water from the catchment to the cistern before it evaporated or was lost to runoff. The speed and efficiency of this transfer system was essential in a desert environment. The window between the moment rain fell and the moment it was either stored or lost could be measured in minutes. The cisterns themselves were typically positioned at low points in the terrain, where gravity would bring water to them naturally, or at the ends of carefully designed channel systems that collected water from areas of higher elevation. Inside the cisterns, sedimentation was managed by allowing incoming water to enter at one end of the chamber, while the drift point was positioned at the opposite end, so that suspended sediment had the maximum distance to settle before reaching the water that people would actually drink. Some Nabatean cisterns included internal baffles, low stone walls across the interior of the chamber that served as settling barriers, forcing incoming water to flow over and around them and dropping its sediment load progressively as it made its way toward the outlet. The cisterns of the ancient Levant, including those of the Nabateans, the Israelites, and the numerous other cultures that inhabited that water-scarce landscape, were sealed with hydraulic lime plaster to prevent the leakage that would have made them useless. The application and long-term performance of this plaster was crucial to the functioning of the entire system, and ancient builders devoted considerable care and skill to getting it right. A cistern that leaked was not just partially functional. Depending on where the leak was and how severe, it could be completely useless, because water that should have been available in August might have seeped away by March. The plastering of cistern walls was, therefore, a critical and skilled operation, one that was taken seriously as a craft and performed by specialists who understood the material properties of lime and the specific techniques needed to apply it in ways that would remain watertight for years or decades under the mechanical and thermal stresses of repeated and emptying. The scale of the basilica cistern is difficult to convey in words. Walking through it, as modern visitors still do, following wooden boardwalks above the water, in the dim light that is all the space has ever known, produces a feeling that is genuinely difficult to categorize. It is part architectural awe, part geological unease, the sensation of being somewhere that exists outside the normal categories of human-built space. The columns that support the ceiling are themselves objects of extraordinary interest. They are not uniform, not purpose-built for this space, but salvaged from earlier Roman structures across the empire and reassembled here in a display of imperial recycling that speaks to the vast organizational reach of the Byzantine state. Some are Corinthian, some Doric, some plain, a heterogeneous collection of architectural fragments repurposed in service of the water supply of Constantinople, the greatest city in the medieval world. At the far end of the cistern, beneath two of the columns, rest the stone heads of Medusa, enormous carved faces, one positioned sideways and one upside down. Their origins and their placement here, a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, whether they were placed sideways and upside down to neutralize the mythological danger of Medusa's petrifying gaze, or simply because they were convenient blocks of the right size for column bases, is a question that the ancient workers who placed them there did not leave us an answer to. What is certain is that they have been sitting in the dark under Constantinople for 1500 years, staring at nothing, waist deep in water, outlasting every empire, every invader, every political convulsion that the city above them has experienced. There is something deeply affecting about that. The water engineers of the ancient world built things that lasted. The basilica cistern was designed to hold approximately 80,000 cubic meters of water, a volume sufficient to supply the great palace complex and surrounding areas of Constantinople for an extended period, even if the aqueduct system that normally fed the city was disrupted by drought, military siege, or structural failure. This logic of redundancy, of building underground storage as insurance against the failure of surface systems, was a consistent theme in Byzantine water management, and it reflected a hard-won understanding that no single water supply infrastructure was reliable in all circumstances. An underground cistern, sealed and protected, could maintain its water supply through conditions that would render surface channels and aqueducts useless. It was the deep reservoir against catastrophe, the hidden reserve that made the difference between a city that survived a siege and one that did not. But the basilica cistern, magnificent as it is, represents a relatively late and highly developed expression of the underground reservoir tradition. The roots of that tradition are far older and geographically far more diverse. In Sri Lanka, the ancient Sinhalese civilization that flourished in the dry zone of the island, beginning more than 2,000 years ago, developed a system of underground and semi-underground water storage chambers, known collectively as weir, when referring to the larger tank systems that represented one of the most comprehensive and sophisticated hydraulic engineering achievements of the ancient world. The Sinhalese approach to water management was not confined to a single type of structure, but integrated multiple technologies. Large surface tanks that collected and stored monsoon rainfall, underground cisterns cut into the bedrock for more secure storage, and elaborate channel networks that distributed water across thousands of acres of rice paddy. What made the Sinhalese system remarkable was not any single structure, but the integration of the whole, the way that individual tanks and cisterns were connected to one another through channels and overflow mechanisms that allowed water to cascade from one to the next in a precisely calibrated sequence, so that excess water from an overfull reservoir could be transferred automatically to a less full one without manual intervention. This required a level of hydrological planning, an understanding of how water moved across the landscape and through the underground systems at a scale of many square miles that represents a form of systems engineering sophistication entirely comparable to what we associate with the modern discipline. The weir system at its peak supported a population in the dry zone of Sri Lanka that is estimated to have been comparable to the population of that same region today. Despite the intervening centuries of political disruption, foreign invasion, and colonial neglect that caused many of the ancient hydraulic systems to fall into disrepair, the city of Anuradhapura, the ancient capital that stood at the center of this hydraulic civilization, was by the standards of the ancient world enormous. A city of hundreds of thousands of people, sustained entirely by engineered water infrastructure, in a landscape that receives less than 60 inches of rainfall annually, most of it concentrated in a monsoon season of just a few months. The underground cisterns that supplemented the great surface tanks were a critical component of this system, providing the stable weather-independent storage that made the dry season bridge possible. Across the Indian subcontinent, the tradition of underground water chambers took a distinctive architectural form in the construction of stepwells, known in different regional languages as Vov, Boli, or Kundi, that combined the practical function of water access with architectural achievement of the highest order. A stepwell is, at its most basic, an inverted tower, a shaft dug into the ground, wide at the top and narrowing toward the water table at the bottom. with steps or ramps descending along the interior walls to allow access to the water regardless of how far it had receded during the dry season. In their simplest forms, stepwells were purely utilitarian structures, functional and relatively unadorned. But in their most developed forms, particularly in the state of Gujarat in western India, they became among the most architecturally astonishing structures produced by any ancient culture. The Rani Ki Vav at Potton, built in the 11th century, is perhaps the most celebrated example, a stepwell nearly 70 meters long and more than 20 meters deep, its descending walls covered with thousands of intricately carved sculptural panels depicting gods, celestial beings, and scenes from Hindu mythology. It is a building whose entire architectural program is underground, whose grandeur is visible only to those who descend into it, and whose visual richness increases as you go deeper, as if the architects and patrons were rewarding those who committed fully to the descent with progressively greater beauty. The UNESCO World Heritage inscription describes it as one of the finest examples of subterranean construction in the world, and this assessment does not seem hyperbolic to anyone who has stood at the bottom of it, surrounded by carved stone on all sides, with the sky a bright rectangle far above and the water of the underlying aquifer accessible a few steps further down. In Cappadocia, in the volcanic tufa landscape of central Anatolia, now central Turkey, ancient engineers carved something even more extreme than a simple underground reservoir, entire underground cities, of which Derinkuyu is the most studied and most accessible to modern visitors. The volcanic tufa of Cappadocia is one of the most workable stone materials on Earth, a compressed volcanic ash that is soft enough to be cut with iron tools, yet stable enough to hold its shape once cut, and so well insulated that underground spaces carved in it maintain remarkably stable temperatures year-round. Ancient inhabitants of the region, beginning in prehistoric times and continuing through the Byzantine period, exploited these properties to create underground habitations that at their largest extended to depths of 60 meters below the surface and could shelter tens of thousands of people. The water management within these underground cities was as sophisticated as the rest of their infrastructure. Wells were sunk at multiple levels to access the water table below, with some wells extending through 8 or more underground floors before reaching water. The wells were designed so that they could be sealed from above in times of military threat, blocking both enemy access and any possibility of the enemy poisoning the water supply, while remaining accessible from within the underground city through disguised openings. Water storage chambers at multiple levels held reserves that could sustain the population for extended periods without the need for any contact with the surface, which was precisely the point of the entire underground city concept, to create a refuge that was completely self-sufficient, including for water, against the threat of surface attack. In the ancient Americas, underground water chambers developed independently in multiple cultural contexts. The ancient Maya, as noted in the previous segment, carved cholchins into the limestone bedrock of the Yucatan, and these bottle-shaped cisterns were distributed across both urban and agricultural landscapes in densities that reflect a systematic approach to water security at the community level. But beyond the cholchin tradition, some Maya cities developed more ambitious underground water storage systems, particularly in the lowland regions, where the water table was too deep to be accessed by ordinary wells and surface water sources were absent or seasonal. At the site of Uzmale in the Yucatan, the ancient city's water supply depended almost entirely on a system of underground cisterns cut into the limestone bedrock, supplemented by carefully shaped surface plazas that were designed to function as catchment surfaces, channeling rainwater into cistern intakes through drains concealed in the catchment. Takes through drains concealed through drains canst. Cans quarrinkens depends incipens consixinginit, but cowdening, gins with consixinit at with foid canit cup with kinip with proper with ha imit with its whisper, word the fudway scout kmex, and who plek puppet at wood pap wood papa at worth, wick more at more spawa, or power to watka, or sakat glow work, where they've got with the act the guard that asks what words that this power, but the spurs in the American Southwest, the ancient Pueblo cultures developed a different approach to underground water storage that was integrated with their architectural traditions in a way that reflects the specific character of the canyon landscape in which they lived. The great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and the surrounding region were built into naturally occurring overhangs and alcoves in canyon walls, and the water management for these communities had to be adapted to the vertical multi-level geography of the canyon environment. Cisterns were carved into the bedrock of alcove floors, positioned to collect water dripping from the sandstone above, and connected through channels to supplementary storage within the dwelling structures themselves. The efficiency of these systems, their capacity to collect and store the maximum possible fraction of the limited precipitation that fell on the canyon landscape, reflects the same imperative that drove water engineering across the ancient world. In an environment where water was scarce, every drop had to be caught, stored, and used. What unites all of these underground reservoir traditions across their enormous geographical and cultural diversity is the combination of practical necessity and genuine grandeur. The people who built these structures were solving a survival problem, yes, but in solving it, they created spaces that transcended the purely functional and entered a register of human achievement that we should recognize as profound. An underground cistern that holds 80,000 cubic meters of water and is supported by 336 marble columns is not merely an engineering solution. It is a statement about what a civilization values, about the seriousness with which it takes the problem of survival, about the willingness of its rulers and its people to invest in permanence rather than immediacy. That statement, made in stone and water in the dark beneath Istanbul, or in the stepwells of Gujarat, or in the underground cities of Cappadocia, speaks across the centuries with a clarity that more celebrated monuments sometimes lack. This is what we built to live. This is how serious we were about living. Segment 8. Filtration. Before filtration was a word, ancient people could not test their water. They had no microscopes to see the microorganisms that swam invisibly in contaminated sources, no germ theory to explain why some water made people sick and other water did not, no chemical tests to detect the dissolved minerals and organic compounds that distinguished safe water from dangerous, no instruments of any kind beyond their own senses and the empirical evidence of health outcomes in the communities that drank from different sources. And yet, many ancient water systems show a degree of sophistication in water treatment and purification in what we would now call filtration, sedimentation, and biological deactivation that is not the product of accident or superstition, but of careful, multi-generational observation and the gradual, systematic application of what that observation revealed. The realization that water quality varied, that some sources were safer than others, that some treatments improved water that would otherwise make people sick, was one of the most consequential empirical discoveries in human history. It preceded the understanding of why water quality varied by thousands of years, which tells us something important about the relationship between practical knowledge and theoretical understanding. You do not need to understand the mechanism to act effectively on the outcome. If every time you draw water from source A, people get sick, and every time you draw water from source B, they do not, you have all the information you need to make the right choice, even if the word bacteria does not exist in your language, and the concept of microbiological contamination has not yet been formulated in any human mind. The ancient evidence for deliberate water treatment is surprisingly extensive and geographically diverse. In ancient India, texts including the Sushruta Samhita, a medical compendium compiled sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, but drawing on traditions far older, describe a range of water purification techniques that include boiling, solar exposure, filtration through cloth or sand, and the addition of various natural substances, including copper, certain plant materials, and heated iron. The recommendation to store water in copper vessels, which appears across multiple ancient cultures, including India, Egypt, and the pre-Columbian Americas, is particularly interesting because it represents an empirically derived practice that modern microbiology has confirmed is genuinely effective. Copper ions are toxic to a wide range of bacterial and other microorganisms, and water stored in copper vessels does become measurably safer from a bacteriological standpoint over time. The ancient users of copper storage vessels did not know about copper ions. They knew that water stored this way made people sick less often, and that was sufficient. In the Qanat systems of Persia, the most important filtration process was not deliberate, but geological, an emergent property of the systems. Design that the ancient engineers who built it understood and valued, even if they could not have explained the mechanism. As described in an earlier segment, Qanat water originated in the snowfields and rainfall of high mountains, percolating through the alluvial fans at the mountain base before entering the Qanat intake. That percolation, the passage of water through hundreds of feet of gravel, sand, and fractured rock, constituted a natural filtration process of extraordinary effectiveness. Suspended particles were removed by physical straining as water passed through pore spaces in the rock, too small for the particles to follow. Many dissolved organic compounds were broken down by the microbial communities that inhabit the upper layers of the soil. Biological pathogens, bacteria, parasites, viral particles, were removed by the combined action of physical straining, adsorption to mineral surfaces, and the hostile chemical environment of the subsurface through which the water moved. By the time water reached the Kanat outlet, it had been effectively filtered to a degree that no above-ground treatment system of comparable antiquity could match. The long underground journey was, in hydrological terms, the filtration. This is why Kanat water was consistently described by ancient travelers and commentators as exceptionally clean, clear, and wholesome, not because of any deliberate treatment, but because the geology of the system had done the treatment automatically. The ancient engineers who designed Kanats did not build them with the explicit intention of producing filtered water. They built them to access underground water that was naturally protected from surface contamination. The filtration was a consequence of the design, not its goal. But experienced Mucan masters surely understood that there was a relationship between the underground journey of the water and its quality at the outlet, even if they expressed that understanding in terms of the water being naturally pure rather than filtered. More deliberate filtration appears in the archaeological and textual record of ancient Rome, where the sophistication of the water supply system created both the opportunity and the necessity for formal water treatment infrastructure. Roman aqueducts delivered water from springs and rivers to cities across the empire, and the quality of that water varied enormously depending on the source and the route. Water from mountain springs was generally excellent. Water from lowland rivers, particularly those that flowed through populated and agricultural areas, could be heavily contaminated with sediment and biological material. The Romans addressed this by constructing settling tanks, piscinae limaria, upstream of their distribution systems, allowing water to stand in large, shallow basins for sufficient time that suspended sediment settled to the bottom before the clarified water flowed forward into the distribution network. The settling tanks were not the only treatment stage in the best Roman systems. At Pompeii, NCMs, and other well-studied Roman water supply sites, the archaeological evidence shows a multi-stage process: settling basins first, then distribution through lead and ceramic pipes into castellum aquae distribution chambers, where water was further clarified before being divided into the separate supply lines for public fountains, baths, and private consumers. The sequence of tanks, each one lower than the previous, each one allowing progressively finer particles to settle, was an empirically derived approximation of what modern water treatment calls progressive clarification. The same basic principle, implemented in stone and gravity rather than steel and electricity. Filtration through granular media, sand, gravel, and crushed materials appears in ancient water management contexts across multiple cultures. In ancient Egypt, there is textual and artistic evidence for the filtration of Nile water through sand in ceramic vessels before consumption, a practice that would have been particularly valuable during the annual flood season, when the Nile ran brown with suspended silt and was at its most bacteriologically dangerous. The same principle, passing water through a bed of fine granular material to remove suspended particles and biological contaminants, underlies the modern slow sand filter, which was developed in 19th century Europe and remains one of the most effective and widely used water treatment technologies in the developing world today. In ancient China, the purification of water through filtration and boiling was documented in texts dating to the Han Dynasty and earlier, and archaeological evidence suggests that systematic water treatment practices were widespread in ancient Chinese urban communities. The recommendation to boil drinking water, which appears in Chinese medical texts from at least the 1st century of the Common Era, is particularly significant because boiling is the single most effective simple water treatment method available. It kills virtually all biological pathogens that cause waterborne disease, regardless of their specific nature. Whether ancient Chinese practitioners recommended boiling because they understood that it killed something in the water, or simply because they observed that boiled water was associated with better health outcomes, the practical effect was the same. Communities that boiled their water had lower rates of waterborne disease. The use of charcoal as a water treatment medium is another ancient practice that modern science has confirmed is genuinely effective. Activated charcoal, charcoal that has been processed to maximize its surface area, is one of the most powerful adsorbents known to chemistry, capable of removing a wide range of dissolved organic compounds and some inorganic contaminants from water by binding them to its surface. Ancient practitioners did not use activated charcoal in the technical sense, but they did use charcoal in various forms as a water treatment, pouring water through beds of charcoal or adding charcoal to storage vessels, and in doing so they were harnessing a genuinely effective purification mechanism. In the Indus Valley civilization of the 3rd millennium BCE, one of the earliest urban cultures in human history, the archaeological evidence at sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveals an astonishing degree of attention to water quality and sanitation. The drainage systems of these ancient cities were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, carefully designed to separate wastewater from clean water supply, to carry sewage away from residential areas through covered drains, and to ensure that the water in the public wells that served each neighborhood was not contaminated by the waste disposal infrastructure. The spatial separation of clean and dirty water, the fundamental principle of modern public health sanitation engineering, was not something that the ancient Indus Valley planners stumbled upon accidentally. It was built into the design of their cities from the beginning, which implies a level of understanding about the relationship between water contamination and disease that is remarkable for its antiquity. The Nabatean water management system at Petra showed similar attention to water quality through design. The settling tanks that interrupted the flow of water from the catchment surfaces to the cisterns were not merely practical conveniences for reducing maintenance needs by preventing sediment from accumulating in the cisterns themselves. They also served a water quality function, allowing the biological material and dissolved organic compounds carried in runoff from the catchment surfaces to begin breaking down before the water entered long-term storage. The multi-stage nature of the Nabatean system, catchment, channel, settling tank, cistern, secondary distribution, created multiple opportunities for water quality improvement, even if each individual stage was designed primarily with a different specific function in mind. What all of these ancient filtration and treatment traditions reveal is a form of practical public health intelligence that emerged independently across multiple cultures as a response to the observed relationship between water quality and human health. Ancient people did not have germ theory, but they had epidemiology of the most direct and immediate kind. They could see, across generations and communities, that certain water practices were associated with sickness and others with health, and the best of them drew the obvious practical conclusion and changed their behavior. The sophistication of ancient water treatment was not uniform. There were cultures that paid close attention to water quality and cultures that paid little, but where it developed as a genuine response to genuine observation, not as superstition or ritual. It was empirical public health, conducted without the vocabulary of modern medicine, but guided by the same fundamental logic: observe outcomes, identify patterns, act on the evidence. The legacy of this ancient understanding is visible in the design of modern water treatment systems, which, stripped of their industrial scale and mechanization, implement the same basic principles that ancient engineers discovered. Through trial and error, settle out the particles, filter through granular media, store in protected containers away from contamination, treat with disinfecting agents when necessary. The continuity between the sand filter in an ancient Egyptian household vessel and the slow sand filter in a modern municipal water treatment plant is not merely metaphorical. It is a direct lineage of practical discovery, passed forward through centuries of accumulated experience, of which the modern engineer is the latest and most technically equipped inheritor. Segment 9. The people who worked in the dark. It would be easy, dangerously easy, to discuss ancient water systems as abstractions, to speak of canuts and cisterns and filtration systems as if they were self-creating phenomena, products of some impersonal engineering genius that floated free of actual human bodies, actual human effort, actual human fear and pain and exhaustion. The archaeological record encourages this tendency, because what it preserves is stone and plaster and ceramic pipe, not muscle and sweat and the sound of a man's breathing in a narrow shaft 100 feet underground. The people who built the great ancient water chambers are, for the most part, invisible to us. No portraits, few names, almost no individual testimony about what their working lives were actually like, but they were there, and their work, the specific, physical, dangerous, skilled work of cutting rock and hauling rubble and managing fire in enclosed spaces and descending into the earth on ropes, was not peripheral to the story of ancient water management. It was the story. Everything else, the engineering intelligence, the hydrological understanding, the social organization of water distribution, was built on the foundation of that physical labor, performed by human beings whose daily lives were shaped by conditions that most modern people would find not merely uncomfortable, but terrifying. The Mundane workers of Persia, who built and maintained the great qanat systems of the Iranian plateau, were among the most specialized and in some ways most respected laborers in the ancient Persian world. They formed a hereditary professional caste. The knowledge and skill of qanat construction passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, in a chain of transmission that stretched back, in some family lineages, for many generations. This hereditary character of the profession was not merely tradition, it was functional necessity. The knowledge required to build a qanat safely and successfully was too extensive, too contextual, and too deeply embodied to be acquired quickly. A young Mundane who began his apprenticeship at 10 or 12 years old might spend 15 or 20 years working under a master before he was trusted to supervise the sinking of a major new shaft independently. The investment of time and experience required was comparable to that of the most demanding craft specializations in the ancient world. The working conditions that these specialists endured routinely would be classified, in any modern occupational safety framework, as among the most hazardous imaginable. The basic environment of qanat construction, a narrow tunnel, perhaps 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, extending horizontally through rock and soil for distances that could reach many miles, lit only by small oil lamps carried by the workers themselves, ventilated only by whatever air circulation the vertical access shafts managed to create, presented a combination of hazards that were each individually significant and collectively formidable. Oxygen depletion was the most constant and insidious danger. In a confined underground space, the normal atmospheric concentration of approximately 21% oxygen is consumed by both the burning of lamps and the breathing of workers, and without adequate ventilation, that concentration drops steadily as work continues. The symptoms of oxygen deprivation begin subtly: a slight increase in breathing rate, a mild headache, and progress to more acute impairment, confusion, loss of coordination, impaired judgment, before culminating in loss of consciousness. The insidious quality of the process is that impaired judgment is among its early symptoms, which means that a worker becoming dangerously oxygen deprived may be precisely the person least capable of recognizing and responding to the danger they are in. Ancient underground workers managed this risk through the monitoring of their lamps, which respond to declining oxygen concentration faster than human physiology does. The oil lamps used in ancient underground work burned with a yellow-orange flame at normal oxygen concentrations. As oxygen declined, the flame shortened and turned increasingly yellow and dim, before eventually guttering out. Workers learned to read these changes in flame character as a calibrated warning system, withdrawing from the workface and moving toward the nearest ventilation shaft when the flame began to change, before the oxygen level had fallen to the point where human performance was impaired. In the most disciplined ancient underground work traditions, a team would have a designated flame watcher whose primary job was to monitor lamp behavior and call the retreat signal when flame quality deteriorated beyond a specified threshold. The rope communication systems that connected underground workers to the surface crews above them were a technological solution to a problem that was as much psychological as practical. A worker 100 feet underground, unable to see daylight, unable to hear surface sounds, dependent entirely on the surface crew for their ability to return to the surface, is in a position of extreme psychological vulnerability. The knowledge that the rope was there, that a specific pattern of tugs would bring the windless crew to attention, that another pattern would start the mechanism that would haul them upward, that the crew above was attentive and ready, was what made it psychologically possible to descend into that environment and work productively there. The rope was not just a mechanical device. It was a lifeline in the most literal psychological sense, and the systems of signals and protocols that governed its use were as important to the functioning of ancient underground water construction as any tool or material. Different cultures developed different rope signal systems, but the common architecture of the problem, the need to communicate specific actionable messages between people who cannot see or hear each other clearly, led to broadly similar solutions. Simple binary signals, one tug versus two tugs, could convey a limited vocabulary of critical messages. More complex systems added layers of meaning through combinations and sequences, allowing a wider range of communications while remaining simple enough that workers could remember and execute them reliably under the stress and oxygen-thinned air. The most critical signals were always the simplest. The emergency pull that meant get me up immediately, the distress signal that meant someone is injured or in trouble, because the conditions under which those signals most needed to be sent were precisely the conditions under which complex communication was least possible. Flooding was the underground hazard that ancient workers feared most acutely, because it was the least forgiving. An oxygen-depleted worker had time, not much, but some, to respond to the warning signs and make their way toward fresher air. A worker struck by a sudden inflow of water had no time at all. The transition from dry rock to pressurized water-bearing fracture could be instantaneous. One hammer, blow, and the confinement holding back a pocket of pressurized water released, filling a narrow tunnel in seconds with water faster than any person could outrun. The victims of ancient underground flooding left no accounts of their experience, but the archaeological record of collapsed and abandoned water construction projects includes examples where the evidence suggests exactly this kind of catastrophic sudden inflow. The management of flooding risk required a combination of geological knowledge, observational skill, and disciplined procedure. Experienced Mucan masters read the rock ahead of them for signs of impending water, adjusting their approach and their team position based on what they saw. The presence of moisture on the rock face, the sound of water under pressure in fractures, the behavior of the rock as it was struck, all of these were read as indicators of what lay ahead. When the signs suggested a high risk of sudden inflow, the standard procedure in many ancient traditions was to advance very slowly and carefully, with the team positioned well back from the cutting face, with only a single designated lead worker making the most advanced cuts, positioned in a way that allowed rapid retreat and with the surface crew maintaining constant tension on the rope. Cavins presented a different character of danger, less sudden than flooding, but potentially more extensive in their consequences. Rock under the stresses created by tunnel excavation does not fail randomly. It fails preferentially at points of weakness, joints, bedding, planes, inclusions of soft or friable material in otherwise competent rock, and experienced underground workers learned to identify these failure points in advance and to cut around them carefully rather than undermining them. The characteristic spalling, the tendency of rock near an excavated opening to develop cracks that propagate parallel to the opening surface and eventually send slabs of rock crashing down, was managed in hard rock tunnels by leaving the excavated surface as smooth as possible, minimizing the stress concentrations that irregular surfaces create, and by removing any rock that showed signs of incipient detachment before it could fall on its own. In softer materials, the loose gravels and silts of alluvial fans, the clay-rich soils of lowland sedimentary sequences, cave-in risk was managed primarily through the use of linings, ceramic ring liners in Carnot tunnels, stone and mortar arches in Roman subterranean aqueducts, wooden shoring in temporary excavations. All of these were responses to the same fundamental problem: the tendency of soft material to collapse into the space created by the removal of the material that previously supported it. The installation of linings added time and labor and material cost to underground construction, but in lineable materials it was often the only way to make forward progress at all, because an unlined tunnel in loose gravel would simply close back up behind the workers before the next work session began. Beyond the physical hazards, the psychological demands of sustained underground work in the ancient world were substantial. The claustrophobia of narrow tunnels, the disorientation of environments where no directional cues from sun or stars or horizon were available, the acoustic strangeness of underground spaces where sound behaved differently from the open air above, the ever-present awareness of the weight of the earth above all of these affected workers in ways that are documented in enough ancient sources to suggest they were recognized and managed rather than simply ignored. In Persian Qanot tradition, prayers and ritual observances were regular components of underground work, offering both genuine psychological support and a framework of meaning that contextualized the danger within a cosmology that made sense of risk and provided consolation for those who did not return from a shift. The social status of underground water workers varied across cultures and periods. In Persia, the Mucans occupied a respected, if somewhat separate, social niche, recognized as essential specialists whose skills were irreplaceable, compensated at rates that reflected the danger and difficulty of their work. but also somewhat set apart from the mainstream of Persian social life by the esoteric and dangerous nature of what they did. In other cultures and periods, the labor of underground water construction fell to people with much less social power, slaves in some Roman contexts, coerced labor in others, itinerant workers who moved from project to project in conditions that offered little security and minimal compensation. The history of who actually did the physical work of ancient water management is, in many periods and places, a history of people at or near the bottom of their society's social hierarchy, whose labor made civilization possible and whose individual lives and experiences have been largely lives of lives and experiences have been largely egepedids and experiences by Burix Black. And with this is Ixalask in with bad with in weg and how it with a babble of support where but with bad was S weg but with up was a hard with bad what up a art surf back dog whoop hard at a cafas got that roof who are quick to have get I was skirk the bust the book got was that boats does some this what that record does preserve is the work itself, the tunnels and shafts and chambers carved with a precision and care that speaks, across millennia, of the skill and pride of the people who made them. A Connaught tunnel that has maintained its precisely calculated gradient for 3,000 years. A cistern whose plaster seal has held through the equivalent of thousands of cycles of filling and emptying. A ventilation shaft whose placement and dimensions reflect a sophisticated understanding of underground air movement. These are not the products of careless or unskilled labor. They are the products of people who were very good at what they did, who took their work seriously, and who understood that the quality of their work would determine whether the communities above them lived or died. That understanding, that weight of consequence borne by the people who worked in the dark, was perhaps the most demanding aspect of their occupation, and the most invisible to the historical record that their work made possible. Segment 10, Water as Power. Who controlled the chambers? Water is life. This is not a metaphor in the context of the ancient world. It is a precise, operational statement about the fundamental economics of survival in dry landscapes. And because water is life, whoever controls water, in an arid environment, controls everything that depends on life: agriculture, population, military capacity, trade, political legitimacy, and the loyalty of every community within the reach of the water they command. The history of ancient water management is therefore inseparable from the history of ancient power: who held it, how they exercised it, how they extended and consolidated it, and how it could be challenged, undermined, or transferred through the control or disruption of water infrastructure. The relationship between water control and political power was recognized early in human history, and in the civilizations that developed in water-scarce environments, it was recognized with particular clarity and institutionalized with particular thoroughness. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that gave rise to some of the earliest complex urban societies in human history, the administration of irrigation canals, water allocation systems, and underground water storage was not merely a technical function assigned to engineers. It was a core function of the state, managed by the same temple bureaucracies that administered taxation, judicial proceedings, and the worship of the gods. Because in the Mesopotamian worldview these functions were not conceptually separate. The temple was the center of economic, religious, and administrative life simultaneously, and water was central to all three of those domains. The cuneiform tablets that have survived from ancient Mesopotamia, tens of thousands of them, recording in precise bureaucratic detail the economic life of Sumerian and later Babylonian and Assyrian cities, include extensive documentation of water administration. Water rights were allocated, recorded, and enforced by the state. The amount of water a farmer was entitled to draw from an irrigation channel in a given season was specified in legal terms, registered in official records, and subject to enforcement by officials whose job was specifically to manage the equitable distribution of water among competing claimants. Water debt, the obligation to deliver a specified quantity of water to a downstream user in exchange for some other consideration, was a recognized legal category in Mesopotamian law. Water theft, the unauthorized diversion of water from a shared channel, was a crime with specific legal penalties. The sophistication of this legal and administrative infrastructure reflects the recognition that water, in a shared irrigation system is a classic common pool resource. A resource that is non-excludable in principle but rivalrous in practice, meaning that one user's consumption reduces what is available for others, and that without institutional management, the rational self-interest of individual users will lead to collective overexploitation that makes everyone worse off. The ancient Mesopotamians, through generations of experience with the consequences of unmanaged water competition, developed institutional responses to this problem that modern economists studying common pool resources would recognize as broadly consistent with the principles of effective commons governance, identified by Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom in her 20th century work on the subject. In ancient Persia, the political dimensions of Qanat control were equally fundamental to the organization of the empire. The Achaemenid Persian rulers, who built and expanded the greatest empire the ancient world had yet seen, understood from early in their imperial project that the extension of Persian power into new territories required not merely military conquest but water infrastructure development. A territory that could not feed its own population could not sustain a garrison. A population that lacked water would emigrate rather than submit. A region without reliable water management was, in practical terms, ungovernable regardless of who held military control of its surface. The Persian imperial approach to water management was therefore not merely an engineering policy but a political strategy. Build or subsidize Qanat construction in newly conquered or incorporated territories. Tie the local population to the water infrastructure the empire had provided, and in doing so create a form of dependency that was more reliable and more durable than the purely military dependency of conquest. The Persian legal code governing water rights was like the Mesopotamian code before it, highly developed. The Mukan masters who built Qanat systems held legal claims to a defined share of the water produced by systems they had built, as compensation for their investment of skill and labor. These water rights were heritable and transferable, and they could be bought, sold, and litigated in the same legal system that governed land ownership and commercial transactions. The water produced by a Qanat was allocated among multiple claimants: the original investor who had financed the construction, the Mukan who had led the building effort, the agricultural users served by the system, and the state, which claimed a portion of all water production as a form of taxation, through a system of scheduled turns that specified precisely when each claimant could draw from the system, and for how long. The Nabatean kingdom of ancient Jordan and Arabia represents perhaps the most remarkable example of water control as the foundation of political and commercial power in the ancient world. The Nabateans were a people who inhabited one of the most inhospitable environments on earth, the desert landscapes of the northern Arabian Peninsula and the Negev, and transformed that environment, through mastery of water management, into the hub of one of the ancient world's most prosperous trading networks. Petra, their capital, controlled the overland trade routes between Arabia, the Mediterranean, and East Africa, and its ability to do so rested directly on the Nabatean command of water in a landscape that no other power could effectively penetrate, because no other power understood how to find and use the water that made survival there possible. The Nabatean mastery of desert water management. Their knowledge of where seasonal rains collected in underground fractures, where rock cisterns could be carved and hidden, where desert vegetation indicated subsurface moisture, was a state secret in the most serious sense. The locations of Nabatean water sources in the desert were not marked on any maps available to outsiders, not shared with the merchants who used their trade routes, except insofar as was necessary to keep those merchants alive and willing to pay transit fees, and not disclosed to the representatives of the various great powers that sought, at various times, to extend their control over the Nabatean heartland. When Rome finally incorporated Nabatea into its provincial system in 106 CE, one of the most challenging aspects of establishing effective Roman administration was precisely the water management question. The Roman administrators who arrived to govern the new province of Arabia Petrea found themselves in a landscape whose water resources they did not understand, and whose management they could not replicate without the cooperation of the Nabatean specialists who held the relevant knowledge. This dynamic, in which the knowledge of underground water resources constituted a form of strategic power that could not easily be captured by military conquest, was not unique to the Nabateans. In ancient Arabia more broadly, the knowledge of wells and water sources in the desert was among the most carefully guarded and most strategically valuable forms of intelligence available. Bedouin tribes whose territories included known water sources had a form of power that no army could easily eliminate. because the army that did not know where the water was could not operate effectively in the territory those tribes controlled. The protection and concealment of water source knowledge was, in the desert context, a form of defense as effective as any fortification. In ancient China, the management of water infrastructure, particularly the great river management works that protected the agricultural heartland of the Yellow River Basin from flooding, and the irrigation systems that fed the rice-growing regions of the south, was a core function of the imperial state and a primary measure of imperial legitimacy. The Confucian political tradition held that a virtuous ruler demonstrated his virtue through effective management of the land and its water, and the hydraulic achievements of a dynasty were understood as evidence of its mandate from heaven. Dynasties that failed to maintain hydraulic infrastructure, that allowed canals to silt up, dikes to deteriorate, and irrigation systems to fail were understood to be losing their legitimacy, and the floods and famines that resulted from that neglect were read as confirmation that heaven was withdrawing its mandate. This ideological framework gave water management a political salience in ancient China that went beyond the purely practical. The hydraulic engineers who planned and oversaw the great water infrastructure projects were not merely technical specialists, they were participants in the legitimation of imperial power, and their successes and failures reflected directly on the political standing of the rulers who employed them. The legendary engineer Li Bing, who designed and built the Dujiangyan irrigation system in Sichuan province in the 3rd century BCE, a system of weirs, channels, and water-splitting structures that is still in operation today after more than 2,000 years, was celebrated in Chinese tradition not merely as a skilled engineer but as a quasi-divine figure whose mastery of water demonstrated a form of cosmic alignment between human intelligence and natural law. In the ancient Mediterranean, the water politics of Greek city-states illustrate how the control of water infrastructure could be simultaneously a source of civic pride, a mechanism of political competition, and a tool of military strategy. The great springs and aqueducts that supplied ancient Greek cities were public amenities in formal terms, owned by the city, administered by elected or appointed officials, maintained with public funds, but in practice their management was often deeply embedded in the factional politics of city-state governance. Control of the offices responsible for water administration was sought by political factions as a source of both patronage and leverage, since decisions about water allocation, maintenance priorities, and access rights affected the economic interests of large numbers of citizens. When military conflict developed between Greek city-states, water infrastructure was a legitimate and frequently employed target of strategic action, cutting off an enemy city's water supply by diverting the streams that fed its aqueducts, by polluting its springs, or by interdicting the supply routes along which water was carried during sieges, was a recognized and legally unremarkable form of warfare. The underground cisterns that many Greek cities maintained as emergency reserves were, in this context, not merely a hedge against drought but a military asset, a supply of water that could not be easily interdicted by a besieging force that controlled the surface terrain around the city walls. The political economy of water control in the ancient world was therefore multidimensional in ways that defy any simple characterization. It was simultaneously a matter of survival economics, of state legitimacy, of military strategy, and of social justice, because the distribution of water access was never perfectly equal, and the question of who had reliable access and who did not was always a question with political as well as humanitarian dimensions. The deep rock chambers that stored and conveyed water underground were not politically neutral infrastructure any more than modern pipelines and reservoirs are politically neutral. They were built by people with power, for purposes that served those people's interests, in ways that created and reinforced specific distributions of social power. Understanding the engineering of ancient water systems is, therefore, only the beginning of understanding what those systems meant. The full meaning requires understanding who built them, who controlled them, who benefited from them, and who paid the costs, in labor, in money, in political dependency of having access to the water they provided. Segment 11. When the chambers failed, not every ancient water system was a triumph. For every basilica cistern that stood the test of millennia, for every canot that is still flowing after 3,000 years, there were systems that failed, sometimes gradually and partially, sometimes suddenly and catastrophically, sometimes in ways that were the direct result of specific engineering failures, and sometimes in ways that reflected the limits of what any human engineering could accomplish against the forces of geology and climate. The failures of ancient water management are as instructive as the successes, and in some respects more so, because they reveal with particular clarity both the vulnerabilities of ancient hydraulic civilization and the mechanisms by which those vulnerabilities could overwhelm even the most sophisticated engineering. The most dramatic single failure in the history of ancient water management was almost certainly the collapse of the Mareb Dam in ancient Yemen, or more precisely, the series of collapses that occurred across the dam's long operational life, each one a catastrophe of different scale and consequence, and the last of which was sufficiently complete and permanent to trigger one of the most consequential migrations in Arabian history. The Mareb Dam was not an underground chamber, but it was the centerpiece of a comprehensive water management system that included underground channels and cisterns, and its failure is so instructive about the relationship between hydraulic infrastructure and civilizational stability that it deserves extended consideration in any account of ancient water management and its limits.
The dam was built across the Wadi Dana in the kingdom of Saba, the Sheba of biblical fame, sometime in the early 1st millennium BCE. Though the irrigation systems it served may have been under development for centuries before the dam, in its major form, was constructed. At its greatest extent, the Mareb Dam was nearly 600 meters long and nearly 20 meters high. An earthen embankment faced with stone that created a reservoir capable of storing enough water from the seasonal flooding of the wadi to irrigate approximately 9,000 hectares of otherwise desert land. The agricultural surplus produced by this irrigation supported the city of Mareb and the surrounding settlements of the Sabian kingdom, making it one of the most productive oases in the ancient Arabian world and the economic foundation of one of the ancient world's most prosperous and sophisticated civilizations. But the dam was under constant structural stress from the seasonal floods that filled its reservoir, and its maintenance required continuous and expensive effort. The earthen core was vulnerable to seepage and erosion. The stone facings required regular repair. The sluice gates and spillways that regulated water release needed constant attention. As long as the Sabaean state was strong enough to organize and finance this maintenance, the dam held and the civilization it supported flourished. When political disruption weakened the state's capacity for organized hydraulic maintenance, as happened repeatedly over the dam's long history, deferred maintenance accumulated, structural integrity declined, and the next large flood found and exploited the weaknesses that the maintenance failure had created. The Quran records a flood associated with the dam's failure as a divine judgment upon a people who had turned from gratitude to arrogance, a theological interpretation of an event that was, from an engineering perspective, the predictable consequence of maintenance failure in a hydraulic structure under continuous stress. The historical accounts that document the migration triggered by the dam's final catastrophic failure describe the dispersal of Sabaean tribes across the Arabian Peninsula and into the Levant, a movement of people that reshaped the demographic map of the region and whose echoes can be traced in the genealogical traditions of Arab tribes for centuries afterward. One hydraulic failure, compounded by the political weakness that allowed it to occur, set in motion a human migration of continental significance. The failure of the Mareb Dam illustrates a fundamental vulnerability of water management systems that depend on active, continuous maintenance. They are only as reliable as the social and political structures that organize and sustain that maintenance. An underground cistern sealed with hydraulic plaster can maintain its water supply for centuries with minimal intervention if the plaster is sound. A canot system, once built, can flow indefinitely with only periodic clearing of sediment. But a dam, or any hydraulic structure that relies on physical integrity against the continuous pressure of impounded water, requires ongoing, organized maintenance. And when that maintenance fails, the structure will fail, often suddenly and completely when the accumulated weakness of deferred maintenance meets the stress of a major flood event. This maintenance dependency was a structural vulnerability of all complex ancient hydraulic systems, not just dams. Canot systems, for all their relative passivity and durability, did require periodic maintenance, particularly the clearing of sediment that accumulated on tunnel floors over years and decades of operation. As long as the communities served by a canot were prosperous, organized, and motivated to maintain the system, this maintenance was performed on a schedule that kept the tunnels clear and the water flowing. When those communities were disrupted by conquest, by plague, by political upheaval, by the simple demographic decline that could result from any sustained crisis, maintenance was deferred. Sediment accumulated, flow rates declined, and systems that had operated productively for generations began to fail. The collapse of canot systems across the Iranian plateau, following the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, CE is one of the most dramatic examples of this dynamic in recorded history. The Mongol armies that swept through Persia in the 1220s and 1230s were militarily destructive in ways that are well documented. But their most lasting impact on Persian civilization may have been hydraulic rather than military. The Mukan specialists who maintained the Qanat systems were, in many areas, killed or dispersed. The administrative structures that organized and financed maintenance were disrupted or destroyed. The agricultural communities that had motivation and resources to invest in maintenance were impoverished and depopulated. Within a generation or two of the Mongol conquest, Qanat systems that had been functioning productively for centuries were silting up and failing, and the agricultural land they had sustained was returning to desert. The recovery of Persian hydraulic civilization from this blow took centuries and was never complete. Some regions that had been productive agricultural land before the Mongol conquest remained desert for hundreds of years afterward, and some have never fully recovered to this day. The lesson of the Persian Qanat collapse is the same as the lesson of the Marib Dam failure, expressed in a different landscape and through a different mechanism. Hydraulic infrastructure is only as permanent as the social organization that maintains it, and that social organization is fragile in ways that the stone and plaster of the infrastructure itself is not. In the American Southwest, the story of the ancient Pueblo water systems offers a different but equally instructive lesson about the limits of ancient hydraulic engineering. Not the limits of maintenance organization, but the limits of engineering itself against the power of sustained climatic change. The great Pueblo civilizations of the Colorado Plateau, Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Cayenta, and dozens of smaller regional centers built sophisticated systems of water collection, storage, and distribution that allowed them to support large populations in the canyon landscapes of the Colorado Plateau for several centuries. Their cisterns, carved into sandstone bedrock and sealed with plaster, collected and stored the limited but real rainfall that fell on the canyon rims. Their terraced gardens captured and retained soil moisture. Their check dams in canyon bottoms slowed runoff and promoted the infiltration of water into the soil. Their management of limited water resources was, within the bounds of what the environment normally provided, genuinely effective. But the drought that struck the Colorado Plateau in the late 13th century CE was not within the normal bounds of what the environment provided. Paleoclimatic evidence from tree ring records, the annual rings of ancient trees, each one encoding the moisture conditions of the year it grew, shows that the period from approximately 1276 to 1299 CE was characterized by sustained drought, more severe than anything recorded in the region's history during the preceding several centuries. The rainfall that had sustained the Pueblo water systems was simply absent, year after year. The cisterns that had been filled by winter rains emptied and did not refill. The springs that had supplemented stored water dried up or fell below accessible levels. The soil moisture that had supported terraced agriculture evaporated without replacement. No engineering could solve this problem. The cisterns were still there, still sound, still capable of storing water when water fell. The channels were still functional, the terraces still intact, the check dams still in place. The entire hydraulic infrastructure of the great Pueblo civilizations was still present and theoretically operational. There was simply nothing for it to work with. The water had stopped coming, and without water, even the most sophisticated ancient engineering was simply a collection of empty containers and dry channels in an increasingly uninhabitable landscape. The great Pueblo cities were abandoned not because of engineering failure, but because of climatic failure, because the environment that the engineering had been designed to manage changed faster and more severely than any engineering could compensate for. The abandonment was not instantaneous and not universal. Different communities in different microclimatic situations responded differently to the drought. And the process of demographic dispersal from the great centers to the river valleys and other more water-secure locations unfolded over years and decades rather than overnight. But the overall trajectory was clear and the outcome inevitable. By the early 14th century, the great cities of the Colorado Plateau were empty, and the population that had lived in them had redistributed itself to locations where reliable water was still available, carrying with them the hydraulic knowledge and skills that their ancestors had developed, but finding themselves in new environments where that knowledge had to be adapted and reapplied in new contexts. The lesson of the Pueblo collapse is more disturbing than the lesson of the Marib Dam or the Persian Qanat failures, because it points to a category of risk that no amount of social organization or engineering skill can ultimately mitigate. The risk that the climatic conditions on which a water management system is based will change beyond the system's capacity to adapt. The ancient Pueblo engineers designed their systems for the climate they knew, the climate they had observed across the generations of their civilization's development. They could not design for the worst drought in centuries, because they had no data about worse droughts in centuries. Their failure, to the extent that we can call it a failure, was not an engineering failure, in any conventional sense. It was the encounter of a highly adapted regional civilization, with a climatic event that fell outside the envelope of its experience and its design assumptions. That lesson has a particular resonance in the 21st century. When water managers around the world are confronting the possibility that the climate on which their infrastructure was designed is changing in ways that fall outside the envelope of historical experience. The ancient water failures remind us that hydraulic infrastructure, however well engineered, is always designed for a specific climatic regime. And when that regime changes, the infrastructure designed for it may fail, not because it was poorly built, but because the world it was built for has become a different world. The deep rock chambers that ancient engineers carved with such skill and patience held water against the normal variability of climate. Against abnormal variability, sustained, extreme, unprecedented. They could only hold what they had, and when what they had ran out, even the most perfectly engineered chambers were just empty spaces in the rock. Segment 12. What the stone remembers. The ancient rock chambers are still there. Beneath the streets of Jerusalem, beneath the sun-baked fields of Iran, beneath the foundations of Rome and Constantinople, and the ruins of cities whose names have been erased from all but the most specialized archaeological literature, the water chambers wait in the dark. Exactly as they have waited for hundreds or thousands of years, long after the civilizations that carved them have dissolved into history, and the names of the people who worked in them have been lost. Some of these chambers still hold water. Some have dried to dust and silence. Some have been partially explored and partially mapped, their full extent unknown, their deepest recesses unvisited since the ancient workers who cut them last climbed out. And some, undoubtedly, remain entirely undiscovered, sealed by landslide or the slow filling of access shafts, their existence unsuspected by the people who live and walk and build above them. What they share, across all their differences of geography and geology, and cultural origin, and functional design, is a quality that the stone itself carries and preserves. The quality of intentionality. Rock in its natural state is what it is, shaped by geological forces that have no purposes and make no plans. But rock that has been cut by human hands into chambers and channels and shafts is different. It carries in its surfaces the marks of specific decisions, specific skills, specific intentions. The smooth curve of a cistern wall reflects the decision of an ancient plasterer to use a rounded tool rather than a flat one. The precise gradient of a canal tunnel reflects the calculation of a Mucan surveyor standing in torchlight hundreds of feet underground. The placement of a ventilation shaft reflects the understanding, built into the design from the beginning, of how air would move through the completed system. These decisions, made by specific people in specific moments of ancient time, are preserved in stone, with a fidelity that no written record of those people's names or lives has survived to match. The stone remembers what the documents have forgotten. And what it remembers, if you know how to read it, is not just the technical facts of ancient hydraulic engineering, though it preserves those too, in the precise dimensions of channels, and the calculated angles of shaft sinking, and the deliberate geometry of settling tanks. What it remembers is something more intimate and more profound. The fact that human beings were here, working in the dark, cutting this particular stone with these particular tools, at some particular moment in the span of time during which human civilization has existed on this planet. The humanity of the ancient water chambers is inscribed in their imperfections as much as in their achievements, in the tool marks that reveal the direction and force of each individual blow, in the places where the tunnel deviates slightly from its intended slightly interplated in the places slighted with, like it is where it depicted with capted with. Later of Takens, with the Kentids Platix, Practic, it was accounted in captains, can it caps to kapexek, buckin fed to but at that and when to hap, how, up with what go, what with big, call with what the whisk. Were hacked, who have up with where thought, were will, wow, yak, what got the car, who could what, how, through their cocky so, I just with it, go to what ceases go for this. To stand in an ancient water chamber, and there are places in the world where this is still possible. where you can descend into a working qanot in Iran, or walk through an ancient cistern in the Negev, or explore the hydraulic tunnels beneath Jerusalem, is to experience a form of time travel that is more visceral and more direct than anything that can be achieved through reading about these places. The air in an ancient underground water chamber has a particular quality, cool and still and faintly mineral, with a subtle organic richness that is the smell of very old damp stone. The silence is different from the silence of an open landscape. It is a contained silence, a silence that has been there for a very long time and has learned to be comfortable with itself. And in that silence, in that coolness and darkness, the marks of ancient tools on ancient stone communicate something that crosses the distance of millennia with surprising directness. Those tool marks belong to people who were, in all the ways that matter, completely recognizable as human. They got tired, they made mistakes and corrected them. They worked faster on some days than others. And the variation in the density and rhythm of their tool marks encodes something of the variation in their energy and attention. Across the hours and days and months of their work, they cared about the quality of their work. The best ancient water chambers show a level of care and precision that goes beyond what pure functionality would have required, suggesting that the people who made them had something at stake in doing it well beyond the mere completion of the job. Whether that something was professional pride, or fear of failure, or the satisfaction of craftsmanship, or all of those things together, cannot be determined at this distance. But the evidence of it is there in the stone, and it is unmistakable.
The relationship between ancient hydraulic infrastructure and the survival of civilization is one that our own era is slowly and somewhat reluctantly being forced to reckon with. The 21st century is bringing a convergence of pressures on global water systems, climate change altering precipitation patterns, population growth increasing demand, pollution degrading the quality of available water, and the extraction of groundwater at rates that exceed natural recharge in aquifer systems around the world that has no real precedent in the historical period, though it has instructive parallels in the ancient record. The communities that are facing these pressures most acutely are, in many cases, precisely those that inhabit the same landscapes where ancient water management systems were developed. The Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, the American Southwest, South Asia. In some of these regions, the ancient systems are not merely archaeological curiosities, but working infrastructure that remains in daily use. Thousands of qanots still flow across the Iranian plateau, still supplying water to communities that depend on them, still operating on the same principle of gravity-fed underground flow that their ancient builders designed. The stepwells of Gujarat, some of which fell into disuse and disrepair during the colonial period, are being rehabilitated by communities that have recognized their value as drought-resistant water sources. In parts of the Omani interior, the ancient Fai system, functionally equivalent to the Persian qanot, continues to supply water to agricultural communities in a desert landscape that would be uninhabitable without it. These are not museum pieces, they are living systems, and the knowledge required to maintain them is itself a form of living knowledge that is in danger of being lost as the specialists who hold it age and their apprentices choose other livelihoods. The recognition that ancient water management knowledge might have practical relevance to contemporary water challenges is not merely romantic nostalgia for a pre-industrial past. It is a specific and practical observation about the durability and efficiency of systems that were designed to operate indefinitely with minimal inputs, in landscape conditions that are becoming increasingly relevant as climate change reduces the reliability of precipitation-dependent water sources. A qanot that has been supplying water for 3,000 years without pumping energy and with only periodic maintenance represents, in purely engineering terms, a level of life cycle performance that modern water infrastructure rarely, if ever, achieves. The fact that it was designed by people working 3,000 years ago without the benefit of computer modeling or materials science or climate data does not diminish that achievement. In some respects, it amplifies it. There is also something important in the scale and pace of ancient water management that contemporary practice might learn from, not the specific techniques, which are contextual to specific landscapes and geological conditions, but the underlying orientation toward time and consequence that those techniques embodied. The ancient engineers who built major water systems routinely worked on timescales that extended beyond individual human lifetimes, investing in infrastructure whose benefits would be enjoyed by people not yet born and whose full value would not be apparent until long after the builders were gone. This orientation, this willingness to take the long view, to subordinate immediate cost to long-term benefit, to work in the present for the sake of a future that will not personally reward you, is precisely what contemporary societies most need and most conspicuously lack when it comes to infrastructure investment. The deep rock chambers of the ancient world were built by people who understood, in a way that our own civilization is still struggling to internalize, that the provision of reliable water is not a problem that can be solved once and then forgotten. It is an ongoing project that requires continuous investment, continuous attention, continuous adaptation to changing conditions, and continuous transmission of the knowledge and skills required to maintain and develop the systems that provide it. That understanding is written in every shaft and tunnel and cistern that ancient engineers left behind, in the care with which they were designed, the skill with which they were executed, the durability of the best of them across intervals of time that dwarfed the entire history of industrial civilization. What the stone remembers is, ultimately, a form of instruction, not instruction in the specific techniques of canot building or cistern plastering. Those are details for specialists working in specific contexts, but instruction in the more fundamental attitudes that made those techniques possible and worth developing, the patience to work across generations, the seriousness with which to treat the relationship between human communities and the water systems that sustain them, the willingness to descend into difficulty and darkness because what is needed is there and not anywhere else. The deep rock chambers exist because people decided that the difficulty was worth it, that the darkness was navigable, that the water at the bottom of the shaft justified every hammer blow it took to reach it. That decision to go down into the difficulty because what sustains life is there, is as available to us now as it was to the ancient engineers who first made it in the torchlit dark beneath the surface of the earth. The water is still there. The rock is still cuttable. The chambers that have lasted 3,000 years tell us that what is built with sufficient care and intelligence and commitment to the long view can last. What the stone remembers, most of all, is that it has been done before. In the silence of the ancient chambers, in the cool and mineral dark, beneath the world's oldest inhabited landscapes, that memory waits patient, permanent, and ready, whenever we choose to descend and listen, to tell us everything we need to know. Echoes of the DEEP final conclusion. The water beneath everything. We have traveled far in these 12 segments. We have descended into shafts cut by copper chisels in the hands of men who would never see the completed systems their labor made possible. We have walked the length of tunnels that stretch for miles beneath landscapes that appear, at the surface, to be nothing more than empty desert. We have stood in the cool dark of cisterns, sealed with plaster that has held against the pressure of water for longer than most nations have existed. We have read the rock the way ancient as a text written by geological forces, encoding in its colors and fractures and temperature gradients the location of the water that civilizations depended on. We have met, however briefly and however imperfectly, the people who did this work, the Mukans of Persia, the cistern cutters of the Nabatean desert, the shaft sinkers of ancient Sri Lanka, the underground workers of Cappadocia and the Yucatan and the Colorado Plateau, and we have tried to honor their labor by understanding it as fully as the distance of centuries permits. What emerges from that journey, if you have traveled it with sufficient attention, is not merely an appreciation for ancient engineering, though that appreciation is and will, if you let it, permanently alter the way you think about the relationship between infrastructure and civilization. What emerges is something more personal and more urgent, a recognition that the questions ancient water engineers were answering are the same questions that the 21st century is asking again, with a new intensity and a new set of stakes. Where is the water? How do we reach it? How do we store it reliably against the seasons of scarcity? How do we distribute it equitably among the people who need it? How do we protect the knowledge and the infrastructure required to do all of these things across the generations, so that what we build for ourselves is also built for our children and their children and the people who will live in these landscapes long after we are gone? These are not new questions. They are the oldest practical questions that civilization has ever asked, and the answers that ancient engineers developed, carved into rock and sealed with lime and extended through darkness by the light of oil lamps that consumed the same air the workers needed to breathe, remain among the most instructive responses to those questions that human intelligence has yet produced. not because the ancient techniques are directly applicable to modern conditions in every context. Many are not, and pretending otherwise would be a form of romanticism that does no one any service, but because the principles that underlie those techniques, the commitment to understanding natural systems before trying to modify them, the orientation toward permanence rather than short-term efficiency, the recognition that water management is a multi-generational project that cannot be adequately addressed by any single generation, acting only in its own interest, are principles that retain their validity regardless of the specific technical context in which water problems arise. The ancient water chambers also remind us of something about human capacity that is easy to forget in periods of technological acceleration and institutional complexity. That human beings, working with hand tools and inherited knowledge and the accumulated observation of generations, have been capable of engineering achievements of extraordinary sophistication and durability. The tendency to locate genius in the modern period, to treat the past as a long prelude to the real capabilities of the present, is both historically inaccurate and practically harmful, because it severs us from the deep reservoir of accumulated human understanding that the past represents. The people who built the great Connaught systems of Persia, the stepwells of Gujarat, the underground cities of Cappadocia, the cistern networks of the Nabatean desert, these were not primitive engineers working at the edge of what human intelligence could manage. They were sophisticated thinkers operating at the full capacity of what their knowledge and their tools allowed, and in many cases what they created has not been improved upon in the millennia since. The stone remembers them. It will remember them long after we too are gone. Long after the cities above the ancient chambers have changed beyond recognition for the third or fourth or fifth time since those chambers were cut. Long after the specific civilizational moment we inhabit has joined the long sequence of moments that constitute human history. In the cool and patient dark beneath the surface of the earth, the marks of ancient tools in ancient stone will continue to record what human beings were capable of when they took the problem of survival seriously enough. When they looked at a dry landscape and decided that the water was in there somewhere and that they were going to find it regardless of how deep they had to go. That is the final lesson of the deep rock chambers. Not a technical lesson about gradient calculation or hydraulic lime chemistry or ventilation shaft placement. Though all of those lessons are worth knowing, the final lesson is a human one, that the difficulty of finding and managing water in a challenging landscape is not a reason to give up or to move somewhere easier. It is a reason to go deeper into the rock, into the problem, into the accumulated wisdom of every generation that has faced it before. The water is there. It has always been there. The question is only whether we are willing to do what is necessary to reach it. The ancient engineers with their chambers, still standing in the dark beneath the oldest inhabited landscapes on Earth, are the proof. And so, dear traveler, we come to rest here, at the end of a long descent and a longer story. You have walked with us through the silence of underground centuries, through the cool mineral dark where ancient hands once worked by lamplight, through the mathematics of gradients and the chemistry of seals and the politics of water and the fragile, irreplaceable lives of the people who spent their working years in spaces that the sun never reached. It is no small journey. The kind of attention that history asks of us when we take it seriously is its own form of labor, its own form of descent. A willingness to go below the surface of things and find what is actually there, rather than remaining at the level of the obvious and the easily named. Wherever you are as these words find you, whether you are in a city whose ancient water infrastructure still hums invisibly beneath your feet, or in a landscape where the Connaughts have gone dry and the cisterns have silted up and the knowledge of how to tend them has been very nearly lost, or in some other place entirely. Far from desert and ancient stone, but no less dependent on water for every moment of your life. We hope that something of what you have encountered in these pages goes with you into whatever comes next. A slightly different way of listening to the ground beneath you. A slightly longer view of the time in which human choices about water and infrastructure and knowledge and care play out their consequences. A slightly warmer feeling toward the invisible workers in every age and culture, whose labor in the dark made the light above possible. The ancient chambers are still there. The water, where it has not been exhausted by the demands of a world their builders could not have imagined, is still moving through them in the dark. And the stone, patient and indifferent to the passing of everything that happens on its surface, still carries the marks of the people who cut it, a record written not in any language but in the universal grammar of human intention pressed into matter. Go well, good traveler, sleep deeply. And when you wake to find water waiting for you, as it is, in some form, waiting for almost all of us who will read these words. Take one moment, if you can, to think of the people who went underground to find it. They deserve at least that much of our attention. And the water, which has been making its way toward us through stone and darkness, since long before any of us arrived to receive it, deserves our gratitude, our care, and our very best effort to understand, as the ancient engineers understood, that it is not ours to waste. It never was. It belongs to everyone who has not yet been born, and it is our job, in this generation, as in every generation before ours, to make sure it reaches them. Good night, and safe travels through whatever depths await you. History doesn't have to be loud to be fascinating. Sometimes the most incredible feats are found in the cool, damp silence of the earth. We are examining the intricate stone systems that gathered every drop of life-sustaining water in deep rock chambers. Join me for a slow, meditative journey. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The thirst beneath the stone. Before pipes, before pumps, before the hiss of pressurized water rushing through city walls and the gleam of chrome fixtures in tiled rooms, there was silence underground. A different kind of intelligence ruled the dark in those early millennia of human civilization, patient, slow, and carved in stone. It was not the intelligence of machines or algorithms, but something older and in many ways more impressive, the accumulated observational genius of generations of people who had no margin for error. You got water right, or you died. That was the entire equation, and it shaped everything. Thousands of years ago, people across the ancient world discovered something that must have felt, to those first observers, like a gift from whatever gods they worshipped. Deep inside the earth, water gathered. It did not wait for rain. It did not evaporate under the punishing sun. It pooled in cracks formed by geological upheaval millions of years before the first human drew breath. It seeped through limestone walls dissolved over eons by the slow chemistry of carbonic acid, and it collected in chambers that no summer drought could touch, and no invading army could easily poison or destroy. Water underground was, in a very real sense, the most valuable secret the earth kept, and ancient people spent millennia learning how to find it, access it, store it, and protect it. Rather than fearing those dark vaults beneath their feet, ancient engineers descended into them. They brought torches twisted from dried grasses and animal fat. They brought copper chisels and stone hammers. They brought ropes woven from plant fiber and leather harnesses stitched by hand. And they brought something even more essential than any of those tools, a plan. Not a plan scrawled in blueprints, those came much later, but a plan held in the mind, transmitted through demonstration, preserved in the memory of specialists whose entire social identity was built around the mastery of underground water. This story begins, as most great human stories do, with thirst. In the regions where the most sophisticated ancient water systems developed, the high dry plateaus of Persia, the limestone hills of the Levant, the sun-baked plains, the Indus, the Yellow River. But rivers are demanding partners. They flood, they shift course, they carry disease, they dry 2 trickles in drought years. They are the territory of whoever lives upstream, which means they are a source of perpetual political vulnerability. A city that depends entirely on a surface river is a city that can be strangled by whoever controls the headwaters. Underground water had none of those vulnerabilities. It was stable across seasons in ways that rivers could never be, because it was insulated from both the extremes of wet years and the punishing scarcity of dry ones. The great aquifers and water-bearing rock formations that ancient engineers tapped into had been accumulating water for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. Drawing from them was like drawing from a reservoir so vast that within a human lifetime, or even many human lifetimes, it barely seemed to diminish. The ancients did not think in terms of aquifer depletion. They thought in terms of permanence, and for the time scales they were operating on, they were not wrong. What made the development of deep rock water chambers so remarkable is that it happened, in broadly similar forms, independently across multiple civilizations with no contact with one another. The Qanot systems of Persia, the rock-cut cisterns of the Nabateans, the underground tanks of Sri Lanka, the subterranean water chambers of the Aztec and Maya, the carved cisterns of the ancient Levant. These were not variations on a single shared blueprint. They were independent solutions arrived at by different cultures operating on different geology, in different climates, at different technological levels. What they shared was not technology but necessity. And necessity, as the oldest cliché in the human playbook correctly states, is the mother of invention. The people who built these systems were not exceptional in the way we tend to think of exceptional historical figures. They were not philosopher kings or military geniuses or visionary artists. They were, for the most part, specialists of a deeply practical kind: surveyors, diggers, plasterers, engineers in the original sense of that word, meaning people who solved problems with the resources at hand. In Persia, the Muqans formed a hereditary professional class that passed their knowledge in near-sacred secrecy from one generation to the next, treating the understanding of underground water as intellectual property worth protecting. In other cultures, this knowledge was held by priestly castes, or royal engineers, or simply by old men and women who had spent decades observing the land and had accumulated wisdom that no young person could manufacture from scratch. What they all understood, in their different ways and languages and cosmologies, was a truth that modern hydrology has since confirmed with instrumentation and satellite imaging. Water underground is not random. It follows rules. It obeys geology the way a river obeys gravity, finding the path of least resistance through permeable rock, pooling where impermeable layers block its descent, flowing downhill through fractures and dissolved channels at speeds that range from imperceptibly slow to surprisingly swift, depending on the nature of the rock. To access it reliably, you had to understand not just where it was at any given moment, but where it was going, where it came from, and how the shape of the rock around it would influence its behavior over time. That understanding was built over generations through a process that has no clean modern analog. It was not science in the institutional sense. There were no journals, no peer review, no controlled experiments. It was something closer to what we might call empirical wisdom, the slow accumulation of observation and outcome, failure and success, lucky strike and dry hole, passed forward through story and demonstration and apprenticeship. A young Muqan in ancient Persia did not learn his trade from a textbook. He learned it by descending into shafts with his father or his master, watching how the old man read the rock, listening to explanations offered in the lamplight 100 feet underground, and slowly, over years, developing the eye, the capacity to look at a cliff face or a dry riverbed and see, through the surface, what lay beneath. There is something profound about that kind of knowledge. It has a texture and a density that purely theoretical understanding lacks. It is knowledge that has been tested against reality, repeatedly, under conditions where failure had genuine consequences. The ancient water engineers who built the great underground systems of the pre-modern world were not operating in the safety of theoretical abstraction. Every decision they made was real, and the cost of a wrong decision could be measured in thirst, in crop failure, in the slow decline of a community that had staked its future on a shaft that came up dry. And yet they succeeded, again and again, across wildly different landscapes and geological contexts, with nothing more than hand tools, inherited knowledge, and the kind of patience that modern industrial civilization has largely lost the capacity for. Some of the underground water systems they built required decades of continuous labor before a single drop of water reached the surface communities they were designed to serve. The workers who broke ground on a major Qanot often knew they would not live to see it completed. They were building for their grandchildren, investing in a future they would never personally inhabit, sustained by the conviction, learned from the previous generation's investment in the systems they themselves now benefited from, that the work was worth doing even when its rewards were remote. That is, at its core, what the story of ancient underground water management is about. It is not simply a story about clever engineering or impressive archaeology, though it is certainly both of those things. It is a story about what human communities are capable of when they take a long view, when they organize their collective intelligence and labor around a problem that matters, when they treat the hard work of ensuring survival not as a burden to be minimized but as the central project of civilized life. The deep rock chambers they carved are monuments to that capacity, more honest and in some ways more impressive than the temples and palaces that tend to dominate our image of the ancient world. because they were built not to celebrate power but to sustain life. The silence down in those chambers, in the spaces where ancient workers spent years of their lives cutting stone and shaping channels and smoothing walls, that silence holds something worth recovering. It holds the echo of a civilizational intelligence that understood, in a way that our own noisy, spurning, extraction-oriented world is still struggling to grasp, that the relationship between human communities and the water systems that sustain them is not a relationship of domination but of careful, patient, multi-generational cooperation. The rock gives up its water on its own terms, in its own time. The best you can do is understand those terms well enough to work with them. The ancient engineers did, and in doing so, they built some of the most durable and consequential infrastructure in human history. Infrastructure that is not celebrated on coins or in epic poetry, that does not glitter in museum cases or appear in popular accounts of ancient civilization, but that made everything else possible. No irrigation without water, no city without water, no army, no trade, no art, no philosophy without the quiet, unglamorous, underground work of finding where the water was and building the dark chambers that brought it home. This is where their story begins, not in glory but in thirst, not at the surface but beneath it, in the dark, with torches and chisels and the patient willingness to go where the water was, however deep that turned out to be. Segment 2. Reading the rock. The first challenge wasn't digging, it was listening. And listening, in this context, meant something far more complex and multidimensional than simply pressing an ear to the ground and hoping for the best. It meant developing, over years of apprenticeship and decades of personal practice, a form of sensory and intellectual attunement to landscape that modern people have almost entirely lost the capacity to read the Earth's surface as a text written by underground forces, a record of what lay beneath, encoded in topography, vegetation, geology, and the behavior of living things. Ancient surveyors in Egypt, Persia, India, the Mediterranean, and across the broader ancient world learned to read the landscape the way a skilled sailor reads the sea, not as a collection of isolated observations but as an integrated system of signs, each one meaningful only in relation to the others, all of them pointing toward a hidden truth that no single clue could reveal on its own. A slight depression in the earth that seemed at first glance to be merely a topographical accident might, to an experienced eye, indicate a location where the bedrock dipped and surface water had once collected, suggesting the presence of a permeable layer below. A patch of unexpectedly lush and green vegetation in an otherwise dry hillside was one of the most reliable indicators of all. Plants do not lie about water, and certain species in particular, like tamarisk, wisha, will find and mark underground moisture with their root systems, with their root systement. With suspicious Sipisalist, and Mysepisac Pipike Sipupips Bassicated Basapir, up at Kip plates at Butter to Pid up a dup of with the athlux mapitums prepared, but the power at a pat catatat a past quick death wire back hat past as a pack cap of cut work of else book deck escapius that fab to pet work. The behavior of animals was another layer of the text. Certain insects, particularly mosquitoes and gnats in arid regions, tend to cluster near locations where subsurface moisture comes close enough to the surface to create microhabitats of slightly higher humidity. Bees, which need water to regulate hive temperature and to produce honey, tend to establish their colonies within practical distance of reliable water sources, which in dry landscapes often means underground sources that manifest as seeps or springs. Ancient surveyors learned to watch the flight paths of bees toward evening, when the insects were returning from foraging, and to follow those paths back toward their origin. In some traditions, this practice was so established that specialized bee watchers were employed specifically to track the insects' movements and report back to the engineering teams responsible for locating new water sources. The morning behavior of the land itself was a further source of information. In regions where the diurnal temperature swing is large, as it is in most desert and semi-arid environments, ground that is warmer than the surrounding surface in the morning hours, when the sun has not yet had time to heat everything uniformly, may indicate a location where geothermal energy, or the insulating effect of moisture, is preventing the overnight cooling that affects the surrounding rock and soil. Ancient surveyors who spent years working the same landscapes developed an almost tactile sensitivity to these temperature variations, running their hands along rock faces in the early morning at the places where the stone retained an unexpected warmth. These locations were marked and returned to, cross-referenced with other observations, and gradually built into a picture of what the geology below might look like. In Persia, the specialists who performed this work, the muqans, developed their capacity for landscape reading over generations, and the knowledge they accumulated was treated as a form of intellectual capital worthy of protection. Master muqans were among the most highly respected and compensated specialists in ancient Persian society, sought after by kings and local governors alike, and their methods were closely guarded. Apprentice muqans typically spent many years in observation and assistance before being trusted with independent survey work, and the transmission of knowledge from master to apprentice was as much about developing the right habits of perception as it was about conveying specific technical information. You could tell a young surveyor what to look for, but you could not simply tell them how to see it. That required time in the field, in all seasons, under all conditions, until the landscape began to speak to them the way it spoke to their teachers. The geological understanding that underlay all of this observation was sophisticated, even if it was expressed in terms that bore no resemblance to modern scientific vocabulary. Ancient surveyors across multiple cultures understood, in operational if not theoretical terms, the basic principles of what we now call hydrogeology, the study of water in rock and soil. They understood that water moves underground from high elevations to low ones, following the path of least resistance through permeable layers of rock and soil while being blocked by impermeable ones. They understood that certain rock types, limestone, sandstone, certain volcanic formations, tend to hold and transmit water, while others, granite, shale, dense clay, tend to block it. They understood that the boundaries between these different rock types were often where the most accessible water could be found, because water accumulating in a permeable layer above an impermeable one would tend to pool at that boundary and flow laterally along it, sometimes emerging as a spring at the surface where the impermeable layer intersected the hillside. This understanding was developed not through formal geological study, but through the accumulation of direct experience, the correlation, over many generations, between specific surface features and what was found when shafts were sunk into the earth below them. A muqan master in 500 BCE could not have explained the concept of an aquifer in modern scientific terms, but he could look at a mountain valley and tell you with reasonable confidence where the permeable gravel beds that carried water down from the snowfields above were likely to be accessible, where the impermeable clay layers would trap that water and allow a productive well to be sunk, and how deep you would need to go before you struck reliable moisture rather than the dry capillary zone above the true water table. That knowledge was as sophisticated, in practical terms, as anything in a modern hydrology textbook. It was just organized differently, encoded in experience rather than theory, transmitted through relationship rather than institution. The reading of rock also extended to the rock itself once workers were underground. The color of stone told experienced miners and shaft sinkers a great deal about its moisture content and its proximity to underground water. Dark staining on rock faces, particularly the blackish or greenish discoloration caused by the growth of moisture-dependent algae and bacteria, was one of the most reliable indicators that water was nearby. The smell of the air in a shaft changed as it approached the water table, a shift from the dry, dusty smell of arid rock to something cooler and more organic, a faint biological richness that experienced workers learned to detect and interpret. The behavior of the tools changed too. Rock near water tends to be slightly softer and more friable than the same rock type in dry conditions, because the chemical processes that water enables, the slow dissolution of minerals, the penetration of carbonic acid, weaken the crystal structure of the stone over geological time. Skilled shaft sinkers could feel this change in the resistance of the rock to their chisels and hammers, and it told them something about how close they were to what they were looking for. Temperature was another underground guide. The deeper you go into the earth, the more stable the temperature becomes, converging toward the mean annual surface temperature of the region. But in locations where underground water flow is active, where water is moving, through rock fractures or permeable layers, the temperature of the rock and air around that water is influenced by the temperature of the water itself, which in turn reflects where it came from. Water flowing down from mountain snowfields tends to be cold, and the rock around active underground channels carrying such water will be measurably cooler than surrounding rock of the same type. Ancient shaft workers learned to notice these temperature gradients and to follow them, moving toward cooler areas of the rock face in the expectation that they indicated the proximity of flowing water. All of this, the surface survey, the observation of plants and animals and geology, the underground reading of color and smell and temperature and texture, came together in the mind of an experienced ancient water surveyor to form something that was, in functional terms, a mental model of the subsurface hydrology of a given landscape. It was not expressed in equations or diagrams. It was expressed as knowledge embodied, intuitive, holistic knowledge of the kind that modern cognitive scientists increasingly recognize as a distinct and sophisticated form of expertise, one that is in many ways more powerful than purely analytical knowledge because it integrates far more variables simultaneously than conscious analytical thought can manage. The ancient surveyors who possessed this knowledge were, in the truest sense, reading the rock, and what they read in it was the possibility of life, the hidden water that could sustain communities and landscapes that would otherwise be uninhabitable, the underground rivers and pooled reserves that a patient and skilled intelligence could access and bring to the surface. The reading came first, before any tool was lifted or any shaft was begun. It was the foundational act, the one on which everything else depended, and it was, in its own way, as impressive as anything that came after. Segment 3. Cutting the first shaft. Once a water source had been identified through the patient process of surface survey and geological reading, the real work began. And real work, in the context of ancient underground water extraction, meant something that the modern world, with its pneumatic drills, its powered ventilation systems, its laser-guided boring machines, and GPS-enabled survey instruments, can barely begin to appreciate. It meant descending into the earth with hand tools, by torchlight, in heat and dust, and oxygen-thin air, cutting through some of the hardest materials on the planet at a tunnel and system of chai. When it was the decision to invest weeks, months, or years of intensive labor in a location based on the surveyor's reading of the surface evidence. If the reading was right, the shaft would eventually reach water and become the starting point for a productive underground water system. If the reading was wrong, all that labor was wasted, and the team would have to begin again somewhere else, hopefully wiser for the failure, but certainly poorer in time and resources. The stakes of that first shaft were, therefore, enormous, and the decision to sink it was never made lightly. The dimensions of the initial shaft were dictated by a brutal practical calculus. It needed to be wide enough for a worker to descend, to swing tools, to fill a bucket, and to be pulled back out. But every additional inch of width meant additional cubic feet of rock to be removed, additional time and labor, additional cost. In most ancient traditions of shaft sinking across the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world, the standard working shaft was approximately the width of a man's shoulders, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. In the typical case, those shafts intended as permanent access points were sometimes considerably wider. The narrowness was not just an economic decision, it also had a structural logic. Narrower shafts were less prone to collapse, because the rock on either side was better supported and less likely to sprawl and fall under the stresses created by the removal of material below. Workers descended on rope platforms, essentially simple wooden boards or woven mats suspended from braided fiber ropes tied to a windlass at the surface. The windlass, a horizontal rotating drum mounted on a frame above the shaft opening, was operated by surface workers, who would lower and raise the underground crew as needed, lowering empty buckets and raising full ones, responding to the